Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the summer of 2024, when I decided to take a solo hiking trip to decompress from my high-pressure job as a financial analyst in Denver. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors, despite growing up in a city environment. Something about the vastness of nature called to me, promising freedom from spreadsheets, deadlines, and the suffocating rhythm of urban life. My therapist had suggested I try reconnecting with myself after my recent divorce from Mark. 3 years of marriage dissolved by text message and his assistant's lipstick on our bedsheets. The San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado seemed perfect, remote enough to escape the tourist crowds but with established trails that wouldn't leave me completely isolated. I'd settled on a 4-day trek through the Ice Lakes Basin Trail near Silverton, a route praised for its breathtaking alpine scenery and moderate difficulty level. "You're going alone?" my sister Heather had asked over the phone, concern evident in her voice. "At least take Pepper." Pepper was my 3-year-old Australian shepherd, a wedding gift from Mark that he hadn't bothered to fight for in the divorce. Sometimes I thought the dog was the only good thing to come out of our relationship. "Of course I'm taking Pepper," I replied. "She needs the exercise as much as I do." What I didn't tell Heather was how desperately I needed this trip. The panic attacks had been getting worse. Episodes where I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, trapped in a cycle of catastrophizing thoughts that rendered me useless. The divorce had merely been the tipping point after years of anxiety building like sediment in a dam. I arrived at the South Mineral Campground on a Tuesday afternoon. The parking lot wasn't as crowded as I'd feared, a benefit of coming midweek in early June before the peak summer rush. As I stepped out of my Subaru Forester, the mountain air hit me with a crisp purity that made my lungs ache after months of city pollution. Pepper bounded out after me, her black and white coat gleaming in the sunlight as she explored the perimeter of the parking area, nose twitching with excitement. "Stay close, girl," I called, reaching into the back of my car for my backpack. The weight of it felt good as I hoisted it onto my shoulders, 30 pounds of carefully selected gear. I'd obsessed over the contents for weeks, researching ultralight options and reading countless forums about what was necessary and what was superfluous. The preparation had been therapeutic, giving me something tangible to focus on rather than the hollow echo of my empty apartment. I locked the car, double-checking that I had both sets of keys securely zipped in different pockets of my hiking pants. The trailhead sign showed the standard warnings about wildlife, weather changes, and leave-no-trace principles. Nothing I hadn't seen before. "Ready for an adventure, Pep?" I asked, adjusting my trekking poles. She gave a short bark that I took as enthusiastic agreement. The first 2 miles of the trail were pleasant, a steady incline through pine and aspen forests, with the sound of Clear Creek rushing alongside us. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the dirt path. I found myself relaxing for the first time in months, my breathing slowing to match the rhythm of my footsteps. We passed a few hikers coming down, exchanging brief greetings. An older couple warned me about a section of trail that had been washed out by recent rains, but nothing impassable. "You heading up alone?" the man asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "I've got my dog," I replied, gesturing to Pepper, who sat obediently at my side. The man nodded, but his wife gave me a look that I'd seen too often, a mixture of worry and judgment that seemed to say, "A woman shouldn't be out here by herself." I continued upward, deliberately pushing away the irritation. I didn't need their concern or anyone else's. The beauty of solo hiking was answering to no one, setting my own pace, making my own decisions. By late afternoon, we'd reached a small plateau that offered a perfect camping spot, relatively flat ground near a stream, sheltered by a cluster of pines. I was still a couple of miles from my intended destination, But the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, and I'd learned from experience not to push too hard on the first day. Setting up camp was a Zen-like process, unfolding my ultralight tent, arranging my sleeping system, filtering water from the stream. Pepper stayed close, occasionally raising her head to sniff the air but otherwise content to watch me work. As I heated water for my freeze-dried pasta primavera, I watched the light fade from the valley below. The mountains around me took on a purple hue, massive sentinels standing guard against the encroaching darkness. For the first time since Mark's betrayal, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. That peace lasted until about 3 in the morning. I woke to Pepper's low growl, her body tense against mine inside the tent. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the nylon walls shudder slightly. But that wasn't what had disturbed us. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, laying a hand on her back. Her growl deepened, and she fixed her gaze on the tent door. I reached for my headlamp, clicking it on with trembling fingers. Nothing seemed amiss inside our small shelter. My backpack was where I'd left it, along with my hiking boots and trekking poles. I strained my ears against the wind, trying to hear whatever had alerted Pepper. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of pine needles and the distant trickle of the stream. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps circling our tent. My heart rate doubled instantly. Bear? Moose? Both were common in these mountains and potentially dangerous if surprised. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Pepper's growl hadn't subsided. If anything, it had intensified, her hackles raised in a ridge along her spine. I'd never seen her react this way to wildlife before. She was well trained for trail encounters, cautious but not aggressive. Whatever was outside didn't respond to my voice. "I have bear spray," I added, reaching for the canister I kept within arm's reach. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and Pepper's continuous growl. I was about to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing when a voice came from directly outside the tent, so close it couldn't have been more than a foot from my face. "You're in the wrong place, Jennifer." The voice was female, elderly, with an accent I couldn't place, something vaguely European but distorted, as if speaking through water. Ice flooded my veins. How did she know my name? "Who are you?" I demanded, clutching the bear spray tighter. "This mountain doesn't want you here," the voice continued, ignoring my question. "It remembers what your kind did." Pepper lunged at the tent wall, barking furiously. I grabbed her collar just in time, pulling her back. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, fighting to keep panic from my voice. "Please leave us alone." A dry laugh floated through the nylon barrier. The miners thought they could take what wasn't theirs. They woke things that should have stayed sleeping. You have their blood. This made no sense. My family had no connection to mining or Colorado that I knew of. I'd been born and raised in Chicago, only moving to Denver 3 years ago for Mark's job. "You've got the wrong person," I insisted. "The mountain knows," the voice replied. "Agnes knows." Agnes. The name sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the night air. "Leave now," the voice commanded, "or you'll join the others." "What others?" I asked, but there was no response. I sat frozen, listening intently, but the presence seemed to have gone. After several minutes of silence, Pepper's growling subsided, though she remained alert, her body still tense against mine. My mind raced through possible explanations. Another hiker playing a cruel joke? A local trying to scare visitors away? Or simply a hallucination brought on by altitude and stress? I checked my watch. 3:42 a.m. Hours until daylight. Sleep was out of the question now, so I switched on my satellite communicator to check the weather forecast. No signal. That was odd. I'd had 3 bars when I'd set up camp. The rest of the night passed in tense vigilance. I kept the bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. Pepper eventually dozed off, but even in sleep her ears twitched at the slightest noise. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent, I was already packed and ready to move. Part of me wanted to head back to the car and forget the whole trip, but a stronger part, the part that had survived the humiliation of Mark's infidelity and the subsequent divorce, refused to be chased away by fear. "We're continuing up," I told Pepper as I shouldered my pack, "but we're finding a different campsite tonight." The morning was unnaturally still. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, just the whisper of the wind through the pines. As we hiked higher, the trail grew steeper, winding through scrubby vegetation and across small streams swollen with snowmelt. By midday, we'd reached the lower ice lake, a stunning turquoise pool nestled in a rocky basin. On any other day, I would have stopped to soak in the view, perhaps take photos or enjoy a leisurely lunch on its shores. Today, I barely paused, driven by a nagging unease that I couldn't shake. We continued to the upper basin, where the trail opened onto a breathtaking alpine meadow ringed by jagged peaks. Island Lake gleamed like a sapphire in its rocky setting, fed by cascading waterfalls from the melting snow above. The beauty should have been overwhelming, but all I could think about was finding a secure place to camp for the night, somewhere visible from all angles, with no hiding places for nocturnal visitors. I settled on a spot about 50 yards from the lake's edge, on a slight rise that gave me a good view of the surrounding area. The ground was rockier here, less comfortable for sleeping, but the strategic advantage outweighed the discomfort. As I set up my tent, I noticed a figure on the opposite side of the lake, a lone hiker moving slowly along the shore. I watched them for a while, but they never looked in my direction. Eventually, they disappeared around a bend in the shoreline. The afternoon passed uneventfully. I filtered water, prepared my dinner, and even managed to read a few pages of the thriller I'd brought along. Pepper seemed relaxed now, chasing marmots that ventured too close to our camp and returning to me with a satisfied grin each time. By sunset, the temperature had dropped significantly. I added layers: thermal leggings under my hiking pants, a fleece over my long-sleeve shirt, a down jacket over that. Even with gloves, my fingers felt stiff as I secured the tent for the night. I was just about to crawl inside when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched keening that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Pepper heard it too, her head tilting in confusion. The sound rose and fell like a distant siren, but with a quality that was unmistakably human. Or at least, it had been human once. Now it held something else, something older and wilder than human vocal cords should be able to produce. I scanned the basin, searching for the source, but the fading light played tricks on my eyes. Shadows stretched and shifted, taking on forms that dissolved when I tried to focus on them. The keening continued, rising in pitch until it was almost beyond hearing, then dropping suddenly to a guttural groan that vibrated in my chest. I fumbled for my headlamp, switching it on with clumsy fingers. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating rocks, patches of snow, clumps of alpine flowers, but no people, no animals large enough to make such sounds. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly small against the vastness of the mountains. "Is someone there?" The keening stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then a voice, the same elderly female voice from the previous night, spoke from directly behind me. "I warned you, Jennifer." I whirled around, bear spray raised, but there was no one there. Just empty air and the dark outline of Fuller Peak against the twilight sky. "Who are you?" I demanded, spinning in a slow circle, trying to cover all approaches. "What do you want?" "You ask the wrong questions," the voice replied, now seeming to come from several yards to my left. I swung my headlamp in that direction but caught only a flicker of movement, something pale vanishing behind a boulder. "Agnes waits for you at the old shaft," the voice continued, now from my right. "She has such pretty things to show you." Pepper started barking, lunging toward the boulder where I'd seen the movement. I grabbed her harness, not wanting her to chase after whatever, or whoever, was taunting us. The shaft collapsed in '89, the voice went on, now seeming to float above me. Took 4 men with it, but Agnes was already there, waiting in the dark. She likes the dark, likes the tight spaces where you can't turn around, can't run away. A figure emerged from behind the boulder, and my headlamp finally caught it full on. The sight made my blood freeze. It was an elderly woman, so thin she was almost skeletal, dressed in what looked like clothing from another century. A long, tattered dress with a high collar, the fabric faded to a nondescript gray. Her hair hung in white, stringy clumps around a face so deeply lined it resembled cracked leather. But it was her eyes that made my heart stutter. Completely black, with no whites visible, like empty holes in her face. "You're not real," I whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. She smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. "More real than you know, city girl. The mountain was here long before your kind came with picks and dynamite. It will be here long after your bones are dust." I should have run. Should have grabbed Pepper and my emergency pack and headed down the trail. Night hiking be damned. Instead, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those terrible black eyes. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The old woman, Agnes, tilted her head at an impossible angle, like an owl assessing its prey. "Want? I want what was taken. The blood price. The sacrifice that keeps the mountain sleeping." She took a step toward me, and I noticed with rising horror that her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered about an inch above the rocky soil, moving as if walking on an invisible surface. "Every generation," she continued, "one must stay. One must join us in the dark." My paralysis broke suddenly. I grabbed Pepper's harness with one hand and my emergency pack with the other, backing away from the approaching figure. "Stay away from me," I warned, raising the bear spray. Agnes laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Your weapons cannot harm me, Jennifer Williams. I am not flesh as you understand it." She was within 10 feet of me now, close enough that I could smell her, an odor of wet earth, mold, and something metallic like old coins. I did the only thing I could think of. I sprayed the bear deterrent directly at her face. The capsaicin cloud enveloped her, and for a moment nothing happened. Then her form seemed to waver, like heat rising from hot pavement. A shriek tore from her throat, not of pain, but of rage. "Run!" I screamed to Pepper, and we both bolted toward the trail that led back down the mountain. I didn't look back, focusing only on the beam of my headlamp illuminating the rocky path ahead. Pepper stayed right at my side, matching my desperate pace as we fled into the gathering darkness. The trail was treacherous at night, loose scree, exposed roots, sudden drop-offs. Under normal circumstances, I would never have attempted such a reckless descent. But fear drove me forward, overriding caution. We'd covered perhaps half a mile when I heard it again, that unearthly keening, closer now and joined by other voices, a chorus of inhuman wailing that seemed to come from all around us. "Keep going," I gasped to Pepper, though I wasn't sure she needed the encouragement. Her survival instinct was as strong as mine. The moon had risen, casting a silver glow over the landscape that created more shadows than it banished. Shapes moved in those shadows, elongated figures that flowed rather than walked, keeping pace with us just beyond the reach of my headlamp. The old shaft. "Jennifer," Agnes's voice called, somehow directly in my ear despite no presence beside me. "You can't escape what was set in motion before your birth." I stumbled on a rock, nearly falling headlong down the steep trail. Only a desperate grab at a stunted pine saved me from a potentially fatal tumble. As I regained my footing, I saw it, a dark opening in the mountainside that hadn't been there on our ascent. A mine shaft entrance, its timbers rotted with age, half collapsed but still passable. And standing in that entrance was Agnes, her skeletal form blocking the way, those bottomless black eyes fixed on mine. "No," I breathed, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't here." "The mountain remembers," Agnes said, "and now, so do you." Memories that weren't mine flooded my consciousness. Men with pickaxes and dynamite, tunneling into the sacred heart of the mountain. The collapse that buried them alive. The slow transformation as they became something neither living nor dead, bound to the mountain's ancient awareness. And older memories. Indigenous peoples who had considered these peaks sacred, who had never disturbed what slept beneath the stone. The arrival of European settlers. The desecration of holy sites in the pursuit of silver and gold. "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head to clear the foreign thoughts. "What does this have to do with me?" "Blood calls to blood," Agnes replied. "Your great-grandfather was William Williams. He led the expedition that opened the Agnes mine in 1887. I stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. My family has no connection to this place." "The mountain knows," she insisted. "The debt remains unpaid." I backed further away from the mine entrance, pulling the Pepper with me. "I'm not going in there." Agnes's form seemed to grow, stretching taller and wider until she loomed over me like a shadow-given substance. "Then we come to you." The ground beneath my feet trembled. Rocks shifted, rolling down the slope around us. What had been solid trail moments before now felt unstable, threatening. "Pepper, run!" I shouted, shoving her away from me just as the earth gave way. I fell, tumbling in a cascade of dirt and stone. Pain exploded in my left leg as a larger rock crashed against it. I clawed desperately for purchase but found only loose scree that came away in my hands. Then something caught me. Something cold and strong that wrapped around my wrist like a manacle. I looked up to see Agnes, her skeletal hand gripping mine, her black eyes boring into me with terrible purpose. "The shaft waits," she said. I screamed, thrashing against her grip, but her strength was inhuman. She began pulling me upward, not toward safety but toward the gaping mine entrance that now seemed to pulse with malevolent darkness. Pepper's frantic barking cut through my terror. She had circled back and now stood at the edge of the collapse, watching helplessly as Agnes dragged me toward the mine. "Go get help," I yelled to her, though I knew the command was futile. We were miles from any assistance, and no human help could save me from whatever Agnes intended. As I neared the mine entrance, the air grew colder. Not the clean chill of mountain air, but a damp, stagnant cold that smelled of decay and old metal. The darkness beyond the rotting timbers seemed absolute, a void that light couldn't penetrate. Just as Agnes pulled me to the threshold, Pepper launched herself through the air, her teeth closing around the wrist that held me. There was a sound like brittle wood snapping, and suddenly I was free, tumbling backward down the slope away from the mine. Agnes let out a screech that shook loose stones from the mountainside. Her form contorted, limbs elongating and twisting into impossible angles. Pepper kept a grip on what had been her wrist, growling fiercely through clenched teeth. "Let go, Pepper!" I screamed, terrified of what might happen to my dog. To my amazement, Agnes seemed unable to dislodge Pepper. The dog's attack had disrupted whatever power animated the spectral figure. Agnes's form wavered, becoming translucent in places. Seizing the opportunity, I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the burning pain in my leg. I lunged forward, grabbing Pepper around the middle and pulling with all my strength. "Release!" I commanded, and Pepper opened her jaws. We fell backward together, away from Agnes and the mine entrance. I fumbled in my pocket for the emergency flare I carried, struck it against a rock, and held the blazing red light toward the ghostly figure. Agnes recoiled from the artificial light, her form shrinking inward. The keening sound returned, now a chorus of agonized wails that seemed to come from deep within the mine shaft. "This isn't over, Jennifer Williams," Agnes's voice echoed, though her form had almost completely dissipated. "The debt remains. The mountain waits." Then she was gone, and the mine entrance with her, leaving only an unremarkable rock face where the opening had been. I stood frozen, the flare burning down in my trembling hand, waiting for Agnes or some new horror to emerge from the shadows. But there was only the wind through the pines and Pepper's panting beside me. When the flare finally sputtered out, I switched on my headlamp again, examining the area where the mine entrance had been. Nothing, just natural stone and alpine vegetation. No sign that anything unnatural had occurred. Had I hallucinated the whole encounter? Was I suffering from altitude sickness or some kind of stress-induced break with reality? My throbbing leg suggested otherwise. Rolling up my hiking pants revealed a nasty gash and what would become an impressive bruise, evidence of the rock slide that had nearly delivered me into Agnes's clutches. I fumbled for my first aid kit, cleaning and bandaging the wound as best I could. It wasn't deep enough to require stitches, but it would make hiking difficult. We couldn't stay here, but descending further in the dark was too dangerous. I needed to find shelter until morning, somewhere defendable. Alkir away from the site of our encounter. A stand of dense pines about 100 yards off the trail offered the best option. I limped toward it, Pepper staying close to my injured side as if to offer support. The spot I chose was tight, barely room for my tent between the tree trunks, but the close quarters felt comforting rather than claustrophobic. The thick pine branches would hide us from view, and the limited approaches would be easier to monitor. I didn't bother with the tent stakes, simply setting up the freestanding structure and crawling inside with Pepper. I took the precaution of placing rocks around the perimeter, not to secure the tent but to create a warning system that would rattle if anything approached. Sleep was out of the question. I sat upright, back against my backpack, knife in one hand and headlamp ready in the other. Pepper curled against me, her body warm and reassuringly solid. The hours crept by. Occasionally, I heard that distant keening, but it never came closer. Once, something large moved through the forest nearby, heavy footsteps that could have been an elk or a bear, but the lack of reaction from Pepper suggested ordinary wildlife rather than anything supernatural. As first light filtered through the pine needles, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding all night. We'd made it to morning. Packing up was a quick affair. I'd never fully unpacked. My leg was stiff and painful but functional. The descent would be slow but manageable. We stuck to the main trail, avoiding the area where we'd encountered Agnes the night before. I kept expecting to see the mine entrance in daylight to confirm what had happened, but there was nothing, just the natural contours of the mountainside. The hike down was grueling. Every step sent jolts of pain through my injured leg, and the constant vigilance had left me exhausted. Pepper stayed close, occasionally looking back up the mountain with ears pricked, as if listening for pursuers. We passed a group of day hikers heading up, their fresh faces and cheerful greetings so at odds with my state that it felt like we existed in different realities. I must have looked a sight, dirty, limping, wild-eyed with fear and lack of sleep. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, frowning with concern. "Fine," I mumbled. "Just took a fall, heading back to get it looked at." She offered first aid supplies, which I declined with a forced smile. What I needed wasn't in any medical kit. By early afternoon, we reached the lower trail junction. The parking lot was just half a mile away. Relief flooded through me. We were almost safe. Then I heard it one last time. That ethereal keening, now seeming to come from far up the mountain. It was joined by a voice that carried on the wind, faint but distinct. "The debt remains, Jennifer Williams. The mountain waits." I quickened my pace, practically running despite the pain in my leg. Pepper matched my urgency, no longer needing to be coaxed along. The Subaru was where I'd left it, undisturbed. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the lock. Once inside, I started the engine and blasted the heater, suddenly aware of how cold I felt despite the warm June afternoon. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a skeletal figure standing at the trailhead, white hair blowing in a wind that affected nothing else around her. But when I blinked, she was gone. I've never returned to the San Juan Mountains. My leg healed, leaving a crescent-shaped scar that aches when storms approach. Pepper recovered more quickly, though she still growls at the darkness in a way she never did before. I tried researching the Agnes mine afterwards, searching historical records for any mention of a William Williams connected to mining operations in Colorado. I found nothing conclusive, just fragmentary references to a collapse in 1889 that claimed several lives, including the mine's namesake, Agnes Witherspoon, wife of the primary investor. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I hear that keening sound again, distant but distinct, and I know that Agnes is still waiting in her mountain, patient as the stone itself, for the blood debt to be paid. I wonder if she'll wait forever, or if someday I'll find myself drawn back to that place, compelled by forces I don't understand to settle an ancestor's debt. For now, though, I'm staying in the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and electric light. I tell myself I'm safe here, that the mountain's reach doesn't extend to the urban world of my daily life. But sometimes, when I catch sight of my own reflection in a darkened window, I see something in my eyes that wasn't there before, something old and dark and waiting, and I know that Agnes is with me still, her patience as endless as the mountain is ancient, whispering that sooner or later the debt must be paid. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in Colorado just 3 months ago. I still wake up screaming most nights. It was supposed to be a healing trip, a chance to clear my head after my divorce finalized and the custody battle left me with only weekend visitations with my daughter, Emma. My therapist had suggested outdoor activity might help with the depression I'd been battling. Nature has a way of putting things in perspective, she'd said. She didn't know how right she would be, just not in the way any of us expected. My buddy, Tanner Mitchell, had been trying to get me on a hiking trip for years. He was an experienced outdoorsman who'd hiked most of Colorado's 14ers and had been a volunteer for search and rescue operations. When I finally agreed, he was ecstatic, immediately planning a 3-day excursion to the Sangre de Cristo Range, specifically to a remote area near Medano Pass where he claimed the views were life-changing. Just what you need, Rob. Trust me, he'd insisted while we packed our gear in his garage the night before. His golden retriever, Scout, circled our feet excitedly, knowing he was coming along. Scout's my good luck charm in the wilderness, Tanner had explained, scratching behind the dog's ears. Never had a bad trip with him around. Those words would come back to haunt me. The drive from Denver took about 4 hours. We arrived at the trailhead near the Great Sand Dunes National Park by mid-morning. The weather was perfect. Clear, blue September skies, the aspens just beginning to turn gold against the deep green pines. As we shouldered our packs, a park ranger was posting a notice on the information board. "Everything okay?" Tanner asked her. The ranger, a thin woman with weathered skin and the name Ramirez on her badge, glanced at us. "Just a precautionary notice. We've had some unusual animal activity in the area. Probably nothing, but we like to keep hikers informed." "What kind of animal activity?" I asked. She hesitated. "Some cattle mutilations on the ranches near the national forest boundary. Probably coyotes or mountain lions, but it's got the locals talking. You know how superstitious folks get around here." Tanner laughed. "The chupacabra strikes again?" Ranger Ramirez didn't smile. "Some of the older Hispanic ranchers are calling it something else. El Husmeador, the sniffer." She shrugged uncomfortably. "Just local folklore. You boys sticking to the marked trails?" "Planning to camp near Lake Como," Tanner replied, pointing to our route on the map. "Then head up toward Blanca Peak tomorrow, though we won't summit." Something flickered across her face. "That's pretty remote. You've got satellite communication?" Tanner patted his pocket. "GPS and satellite phone. We're prepared." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on Scout. "Keep your dog close," she said finally, "and maybe stick to more populated trails." We thanked her for the warning, but neither of us took it seriously. Colorado was full of regional myths and superstitions, part of its charm, especially in the more remote Hispanic communities that had been there for generations. The first few hours of our hike were glorious. The trail wound through pine forests and meadows bursting with late-season wildflowers. Scout bounded ahead, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear minutes later, tongue lolling happily. The physical exertion felt good, burning away the stagnant energy of months spent in lawyers' offices and the emptiness of my new apartment. Tanner kept the conversation light, catching me up on mutual friends and deliberately avoiding any mention of my ex-wife, Melissa. He'd always been good that way, knew when to push and when to back off. Around mid-afternoon, we stopped in a sunlit clearing for lunch. "How are you holding up?" he asked, passing me a sandwich. "Better than expected," I admitted. "It feels good to be away from everything." "Wait till you see where we're camping tonight. There's this rock formation above Lake Como that catches the sunset perfectly. Your Instagram will explode," he grinned. "If there's even service out here," I laughed. "That's the beauty of it," Tanner said, leaning back against his pack. Total disconnection. Scout, who had been nosing around the perimeter of the clearing, suddenly froze, his ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Tanner called. The dog didn't respond, continuing to stare fixedly into the dense pines. The hair along his spine stood rigid. Tanner stood, whistling sharply. "Scout, come." Scout ignored him, something I'd never seen before. The dog was impeccably trained. "Probably deer," Tanner said, though he looked uneasy. He whistled again, more insistently, and this time Scout reluctantly retreated to his side, still watching the tree line. "Good boy," Tanner murmured, but Scout continued to growl softly. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "Maybe we should move on." "Yeah," Tanner agreed, hastily packing our lunch remains. "We've still got about 4 miles to the lake." As we continued hiking, Scout stayed unusually close to Tanner's heels, occasionally looking back nervously. The trail began to ascend more steeply, winding through increasingly dense forest. The cheerful atmosphere from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence broken only by our breathing and the crunch of boots on the trail. "You ever had Scout act like that before?" I asked finally. Tanner shook his head. "He's encountered plenty of wildlife. Never seen him spooked like that." We pushed on as the afternoon waned. I began to notice the forest had grown eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the whisper of wind through the pines, which somehow seemed to carry half-formed whispers. "Is it normally this quiet?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Tanner paused, listening. "No," he admitted. "It's not." We picked up our pace. The trail became rougher, crossing several small streams. At the third crossing, Scout refused to step into the water. He stood at the edge, whining anxiously. "Come on, buddy," Tanner coaxed, but the dog wouldn't budge. I knelt down to look at the water. It seemed normal, clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. But as I watched, I noticed something odd. Small black particles floated on the surface, swirling in the current. "What's this stuff?" I asked, reaching toward the water. "Don't touch it," Tanner said sharply. He crouched beside me, frowning. "I've never seen anything like that." The particles seemed to be moving against the current in places, clustering together in bizarre patterns before dispersing again. The longer I stared, the more they resembled tiny insects, or maybe symbols, constantly shifting and reforming. "Let's cross upstream," Tanner suggested, his voice tight. We found another crossing point 50 yards upstream where the water ran clear. Even so, Scout needed to be carried across, trembling in Tanner's arms. By the time we reached Lake Como, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. In different circumstances, I would have been awestruck by the beauty. The lake was a perfect mirror reflecting the rugged peaks surrounding it. The water so still it seemed solid. Instead, I felt a growing unease. The silence was absolute. No insects buzzing, no fish jumping in the lake, No birds calling their evening songs. Just that persistent whispering in the wind, almost like voices having a conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. "We should set up camp," Tanner said, dropping his pack near a flat area about 50 feet from the shore. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. Scout refused to leave Tanner's side as we set up our tents. The dog's eyes constantly scanned the tree line, his body tense. We worked quickly, neither of us mentioning the oppressive atmosphere or the fact that we hadn't seen another hiker all day on what Tanner had described as a popular route. As I hammered in the last tent stake, I noticed something on the ground near a cluster of rocks, a small animal carcass too decayed to identify. What struck me wasn't the dead animal itself, but how it had died. The body had been hollowed out with surgical precision, leaving the skin and fur largely intact. "Tanner," I called softly, "come look at this." He crouched beside me, his face grim. "That's not natural predation," he muttered. "Mountain lion wouldn't do that." He shook his head. "They don't leave empty skin sacks." He stood abruptly. "Let's build a fire, big one." We gathered wood in silence, staying within sight of each other. The sun sank behind the mountains and the temperature dropped rapidly. By the time we had a roaring fire going, the lake had disappeared into darkness, though I could still feel its presence, a vast, empty void watching us. Tanner tried to recover some normalcy, cooking freeze-dried meals over his portable stove and offering me a flask of whiskey. The familiar burn of alcohol provided momentary comfort, but even Tanner's attempts at conversation felt forced, trailing off into uncomfortable silences. Scout wouldn't eat, remaining alert and agitated at Tanner's feet. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," I suggested quietly. Tanner looked relieved at the suggestion. "Probably smart. Weather could be turning." We both knew it was a transparent excuse. The sky was clear, stars emerging in brilliant clusters overhead. That's when we first heard it, a sound from across the lake, a low, rhythmic clicking, like someone rapidly tapping fingernails against wood. It continued for nearly a minute, then stopped abruptly. Scout whimpered, pressing against Tanner's legs. "Probably just a branch knocking against something in the wind," Tanner said, not sounding convinced. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. We added more wood to the fire, building it higher than was strictly necessary. Neither of us suggested turning in, though it had to be past 10 o'clock. The thought of being separated by tent walls suddenly seemed unbearable. "You know," Tanner began, his voice deliberately casual, "there are stories about this area. Old mining stories from the Silver Boom days." "What kind of stories?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "Back in the 1880s, there was a mining camp near here. Mostly Hispanic workers from New Mexico territory. Story goes they dug too deep into Blanca Peak, opened something they shouldn't have." He took another swig from the flask. "According to the legend, the miners started disappearing one by one. Those who remained said they could hear their missing friends calling from inside the mountain at night." "Calling for help?" I asked. "No," Tanner said quietly. "Calling others to join them." The clicking sound came again, closer this time from the edge of the forest to our right. Scout began to growl, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our firelight. "I'm going to check it," Tanner said, reaching for his headlamp. "That's literally what the first person to die in a horror movie would do," I said, trying to make it sound like a joke. "We need to know what we're dealing with," he replied grimly. "Keep the fire going. I won't go far." I wanted to stop him, but he was right. Not knowing was somehow worse. I watched as his headlamp bobbed into the darkness, Scout reluctantly following at his heels. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. I strained to hear anything beyond the crackling of the fire. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, I heard Tanner call out, "Rob, bring the first aid kit." I grabbed my pack and rushed toward his voice, my own headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel of light through the absolute darkness. I found him about 100 yards into the trees, kneeling beside Scout. The dog was lying on his side, breathing rapidly. "What happened?" I gasped. I don't know, Tanner said, his voice shaking. He was right beside me. Then he yelped and collapsed. I can't find any wounds, but something's wrong. I handed him the first aid kit, watching as he examined the trembling dog. Scout's eyes were wide and unfocused, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. He might have eaten something toxic, Tanner muttered, but we both knew that wasn't it. Scout hadn't left our sight all day, and he hadn't eaten anything since morning. We need to get him back to the fire, I said, looking nervously at the oppressive darkness surrounding us. Tanner nodded, gently lifting the 60-pound retriever in his arms. As we turned back toward camp, my headlamp caught something on the ground where Scout had collapsed. A small patch of those same black particles we'd seen in the stream, clumping together and then dispersing, like they were communicating. I decided not to mention it to Tanner. Back at the fire, Scout's condition worsened. His breathing became shallow and he began making small, pitiful sounds unlike anything I'd heard from a dog before, almost like he was trying to form words. Tanner cradled the dog's head in his lap, his face etched with worry. "We need to get him to a vet," he said finally. "First thing tomorrow." "Why not now?" I asked, checking my watch. It was just past midnight. "Hiking down in the dark would be suicide with the terrain," he replied. "We'd never make it carrying him. Best chance is to wait for first light. About 5 hours from now." I nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right. We fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by Scout's labored breathing and the occasional crackle from the fire. Around 1 a.m., the clicking sound returned, seemingly from all directions at once. It had changed subtly, more complex patterns almost like a language. Scout's eyes snapped open and he began to struggle weakly in Tanner's arms. "Easy, boy," Tanner soothed, but Scout continued to writhe, his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. That's when I saw them. Tiny points of greenish-blue light hovering just beyond the radius of our fire, scattered among the trees. Not the reflected eyes of animals, but something else. Cold, steady points of illumination that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the clicking sounds. "Tanner," I whispered, "look." He raised his head, following my gaze. His body went rigid. "What the hell is that?" he breathed. The lights began to move, circling our camp in a slow, deliberate pattern. I counted at least 20 of them, possibly more, weaving between the trees like fireflies, but much larger and eerily coordinated. Scout suddenly went limp in Tanner's arms. For a terrible moment I thought he had died, but then I saw his chest still rising and falling. He appeared to be unconscious, or perhaps in some kind of seizure, his legs twitching spasmodically. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely audible. "Now." Tanner nodded, gently laying Scout down on his sleeping bag. "Pack only what we need. Leave the tents." We moved with quiet urgency, stuffing essential items into our packs: water, some food, first aid kit, headlamps. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and the lights moved closer to our camp, the circle tightening. "I'll carry Scout," Tanner said, hoisting his pack. "You lead with the map and GPS. We'll head back the way we came." I nodded, pulling out the GPS unit. My stomach dropped when I saw the screen. "Tanner, it's not working." I showed him the device, its screen displaying random symbols rather than the map. Tanner pulled out his satellite phone, only to find it similarly malfunctioning, the display flickering with the same bizarre symbols. "We follow the trail," he said firmly. "It's pretty straightforward. Just keep heading northeast." He bent to lift Scout, but as his hands touched the dog, Scout's eyes flew open. They were no longer the warm brown I remembered, but had turned a milky white, cloudier than any cataract I'd ever seen. His lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that seemed longer, sharper than before. Tanner recoiled. "Scout?" The dog rose to its feet with jerky, unnatural movements, its head twisting at an impossible angle to stare at us. A sound emerged from its throat, not a dog's growl or bark, but something that chilled my blood. It was attempting to mimic human speech, producing distorted, guttural approximations of words. "Vengan conmigo," it seemed to say. "Come with me." Tanner stumbled backward, his face ashen. "That's not Scout," he whispered. The thing that had been Scout took a step toward us, moving with a hitching gait, as though its body was being puppeteered by something unfamiliar with canine anatomy. Its milky eyes fixed on Tanner. "Te extrañé, amigo," it gurgled. "I've missed you, friend." The circle of lights had closed in completely now, surrounding our campsite only yards away. The clicking had risen to a crescendo, patterns overlapping and interweaving in complex arrangements. Through the trees, I could now make out vague shapes moving behind the lights. Tall, thin silhouettes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Run," I said, grabbing Tanner's arm. "Now!" We bolted, abandoning our carefully packed bags, taking only what was already in our pockets. I led the way, trying to find the trail in the darkness, my headlamp swinging wildly as I ran. Behind us, the thing that had been Scout let out a sound between a howl and a human scream. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching like grasping hands, roots rising to trip our feet. The lights pursued, no longer maintaining their distance but gaining rapidly. The clicking had become a roar in my ears, almost comprehensible now, repeating patterns I somehow knew were names. The names of every person who had ever disappeared in these mountains. Tanner stumbled beside me, his breathing ragged. "Keep going," he gasped. "Don't look back." But I did look back, just for an instant. The sight nearly stopped my heart. Scout was bounding after us, but his body had changed, elongating grotesquely, limbs stretching and reconfiguring with each leap. Behind him, the shapes I'd glimpsed were more distinct now. Impossibly tall, skeletal figures with too many joints, moving with a horrifying grace through the trees. Where their faces should have been, there were only those cold lights, pulsing in synchrony. I turned forward just in time to avoid crashing into a tree, veering sharply left. Tanner wasn't so lucky. I heard a sickening thud and a cry of pain. When I spun around, he was on the ground, clutching his ankle. "Go," he shouted. "Get help." I hesitated, torn between survival instinct and loyalty. That moment of indecision nearly cost me everything. Something cold brushed against my neck, a touch so alien it didn't register as physical at first, more like a thought being planted directly into my mind. Images flooded my consciousness. Dark tunnels winding deep into the mountain, hollow-eyed miners shuffling through eternal darkness, and something ancient lurking below it all, patient and hungry. I screamed, the sound breaking the spell. I lunged forward, grabbing Tanner's arm and hauling him to his feet. He leaned against me heavily, but we moved forward, stumbling through the underbrush. I had no idea if we were still on the trail or heading deeper into the wilderness. Behind us, the transformed Scout let out another of those terrible, almost human cries, closer now. The lights were all around us, appearing between trees ahead as well as behind, cutting off escape routes. The clicking had resolved into whispers now, directly in my mind. "Quédate con nosotros," they seemed to say. "Stay with us." "Don't listen," Tanner panted beside me. "They're getting in your head." We broke through a dense patch of trees into a small clearing. Ahead, I could see what looked like the trail descending steeply. If we could just reach it, maybe we'd have a chance. But as we stumbled forward, a figure stepped into our path. It wasn't Scout, but a man, or something wearing the approximation of a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like antique miner's clothes, torn and rotted with age. His face was partially collapsed inward, as though something had hollowed him out from within, leaving just enough to maintain a human appearance. Where his eyes should have been, those same cold lights pulsed. "Bienvenidos," the thing said, its mouth barely moving. "Welcome." Tanner and I froze, trapped between the approaching horrors behind and this new nightmare before us. The miner thing took a step forward, movements jerky like a marionette. "El husmeador te quiere conocer," it continued. "The sniffer wants to meet you." As it spoke, its chest began to split open, not like a wound but like a door being unzipped from the inside. From the gaping cavity emerged something I still struggled to describe, a writhing mass of those black particles we'd seen earlier, but now forming and reforming into appendages, sensory organs, mouths. It was as though something was trying different configurations, learning what worked best to interact with our world. Tanner's grip on my arm tightened painfully. 3:00, he whispered. "There's a gap." I saw it too, a narrow space between the lights where the trees thinned out, possibly leading to a steeper section of the mountainside. It was a desperate gamble, but our only option. "On 3, I breathed. 1, 2. Before I could say 3, the thing that had been Scout burst into the clearing behind us. It no longer resembled a dog at all. Its body had stretched and reconfigured into something that walked on 2 legs. Its golden fur split in places to reveal that same black, particulate substance writhing underneath. "Tanner," it gurgled in a horrific parody of human speech. "Amigo." Tanner made a sound of pure anguish, and we bolted toward the gap in the lights. The hollow miner lunged for us, arms extending unnaturally, fingers elongating like probes. I felt one brush my cheek, leaving a burning sensation as if my skin had been sampled. We plunged through the gap, the world tilting sharply as we hit the steep slope beyond. It wasn't a trail, but a near vertical drop. We lost our footing immediately, tumbling and sliding down the rocky incline. I felt skin tear from my palms as I desperately tried to slow my descent, rocks and branches tearing at my clothes and flesh. Somewhere in the chaos, I lost contact with Tanner. I heard his shout of surprise, then nothing but the sound of my own body crashing through underbrush. The world became a blur of pain and motion until I slammed into something solid, a large tree that stopped my descent so violently it knocked the air from my lungs. I lay there, gasping, my entire body screaming in agony. Above me on the slope, the lights were moving, searching. I could hear the clicking, more distant now but still searching. Slowly, fighting waves of pain, I crawled beneath a fallen log, making myself as small as possible. "Tanner?" I whispered into the darkness. There was no response. I don't know how long I hid there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The sky began to lighten eventually, gray dawn filtering through the trees. The lights had disappeared with the darkness, but I remained motionless, terrified they might still be hunting. When I finally found the courage to move, every muscle protested. I was covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and bloodied. I had no idea where I was, no equipment, no water, just the clothes on my back and the keys to Tanner's truck still in my pocket. I oriented myself using the rising sun and began to make my way downhill, hoping to intersect with the trail eventually. I called Tanner's name periodically, my voice echoing through the silent forest. As the day brightened, the horror of the night began to feel dreamlike, though my injuries proved otherwise. Around mid-morning, I stumbled onto a marked trail, not the one we'd ascended, but clearly a maintained path. I followed it downhill, moving as quickly as my battered body would allow. I encountered a day hiker coming up the trail around noon, a middle-aged man who took one look at my condition and immediately offered help. He had a satellite phone that worked perfectly. Within hours, search and rescue had been mobilized. I told them a simplified version of what had happened, that my friend and I had gotten separated during a night hike after his dog had become sick and aggressive, possibly from rabies. I claimed we'd been disoriented, fallen down a slope in the darkness. They found Tanner's body 2 days later at the bottom of a rocky ravine about a mile from where I'd been found. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma from the fall. Of Scout, there was no sign. The search teams combed the area for days but found no trace of the golden retriever. They did find our campsite exactly as we'd left it, tents still standing, fire pit cold, our discarded packs untouched. The only strange detail in the official report was that all of our electronic devices, GPS, satellite phone, my smartphone, even Tanner's simple digital watch, had been found completely drained of power despite being fully charged the day before. I attended Tanner's funeral in Denver the following week, still bearing the visible wounds of our escape. His parents were devastated, his father clinging to the small comfort that at least Tanner died doing what he loved. I didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. After the service, Ranger Ramirez approached me. She'd been part of the search team and had driven up from the park for the funeral. We stood in the cemetery parking lot, away from the other mourners. "What really happened up there?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "You wouldn't believe me." She was silent for a long moment, her weathered face troubled. "When I was a girl, my grandfather told stories about El Husmeador," she said finally. "The thing that sniffs out souls, the Hollowmaker." My blood ran cold at the words. "It's just folklore," I said mechanically. She studied my face. "Every few decades it gets hungry. Takes a few before returning to sleep. The old-timers say it's been that way since the mines closed in the 1890s. "Why don't you warn people?" I asked, anger suddenly rising. "Put up signs? Close the trails? Based on what? Local superstition?" She shook her head bitterly. "I file the reports. Unexplained animal behavior, equipment failures, the occasional missing hiker. By the time it reaches Denver, it's all rationalized away. Statistical anomalies, wilderness dangers." She reached into her pocket and handed me a small leather pouch. "My grandfather gave me this. Said it keeps El Husmeador from finding you. I've never had to test it, but—" She shrugged. "I thought you might want it." I took the pouch, feeling the weight of small stones inside. "Thank you," I said, though I doubted any trinket could protect against what I'd seen. "Don't go back to those mountains," she said as she turned to leave. "Ever." I haven't. I sold my house in Colorado and moved to Michigan, as far from mountains as I could reasonably get. I tell myself it was contained there, in that remote range, bound somehow to that place. Most days I almost believe it. But sometimes, in the quiet pre-dawn hours when I wake from nightmares, I think I hear clicking sounds outside my window. And occasionally my electronics malfunction in strange ways, displaying momentary patterns that look almost like words. Messages, invitations. And I wonder if El Husmeador is patient. If it can wait for decades, what's a few more years? What's distance to something that can hollow you out and wear you like a suit? I keep Ranger Ramirez's pouch by my bed. I've never opened it to see what's inside. Some things are better left unknown. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. But I know this. There are things in the wilderness older than our understanding. Things that see us not as threats or even prey, but as vessels. Containers to be emptied and filled with something else. The forest has stopped calling to me in my dreams. Now it just waits, clicking softly, whispering a single phrase over and over. Te encontraré pronto, amigo. I'll find you soon, friend. And it sounds exactly like Tanner's voice. My name is Emily Hall, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, deep in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. The darkness out here isn't like city darkness. In Denver, where I've lived my entire adult life, night is never truly dark. There's always the ambient glow of streetlights, the headlights of passing cars, the illuminated windows of apartment buildings. But here in the remote corners of the San Juan Range, darkness is absolute. It's a physical presence that presses against your skin, fills your lungs, and seeps into your bones. I never should have come here alone. That was my first mistake. My therapist suggested I needed time away. "Emily, you need to disconnect," Dr. Winters had said during our last session. "You've been through a traumatic year, and the constant connectivity isn't helping your anxiety. When was the last time you were truly alone with your thoughts?" The answer was never. After losing my husband Mark in the car accident last winter, I'd done everything possible to avoid being alone with my thoughts. I kept my television on constantly. I fell asleep to podcasts. I worked overtime at the advertising agency, took on freelance projects, anything to keep the noise in my head at bay. "I'm prescribing you some wilderness therapy," she'd said with a gentle smile. "1 week, minimum. No phone, no internet. Just you and nature." So here I was, 3 days into a 7-day solo backpacking trip along the Continental Divide Trail, specifically the segment that winds through the most remote section of the San Juan Mountains. I'd done my research, packed appropriately, left my itinerary with a friend, and even rented a satellite emergency beacon as a safety precaution. I was prepared for the physical challenges, the elevation, the weather, the terrain. What I wasn't prepared for was the silence, and what that silence would eventually reveal. The first 2 days had been uneventful, even pleasant. The physical exertion of hiking with a full pack at high elevation had exhausted me to the point that I fell into dreamless sleep each night. The stunning vistas of jagged peaks, alpine meadows bursting with wildflowers, and pristine mountain lakes had momentarily lifted the fog of grief that had enveloped me for months. But on the 3rd day, things began to change. I was making my way toward a landmark called Windy Peak, a 13,000-foot summit that offered views of the entire range. The trail narrowed as it wound through a dense forest of lodgepole pines. The air felt different here, heavier, stationary, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The constant mountain breeze that had accompanied me for days suddenly died, leaving an unnatural stillness. That's when I first noticed the scratching sound. It was faint at first, a gentle rasping like fingernails on wood. I stopped, adjusting my pack straps as I listened. Nothing. I continued walking, and there it was again. Scratch, 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 seemingly coming from the trees around me, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. "Just a squirrel or a woodpecker," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the sudden prickling along my arms. But woodpeckers don't work in complete silence, and the forest had gone eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Nothing but that intermittent scratching sound that started and stopped with no discernible pattern. I quickened my pace, eager to break free of the dense forest and reach the more exposed alpine terrain ahead. The trail map indicated I would reach Phantom Lake by mid-afternoon, a good spot to make camp. The scratching followed me, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind, sometimes from the trees above. Once, it seemed to emanate from beneath the trail itself. When I finally emerged from the forest into an open meadow, the sound abruptly ceased. I stopped to catch my breath, removing my pack and taking a long drink from my water bottle. The silence was complete now, but somehow even more unsettling without the scratching. At least the scratching had been something tangible, something I could attribute to wildlife or wind or my own imagination. The silence felt deliberate, watchful. The meadow stretched before me, a sea of purple lupines and yellow alpine sunflowers swaying gently in the breeze that had mercifully returned. Beyond the meadow lay Phantom Lake, a pristine alpine lake nestled in a natural bowl formed by surrounding peaks. It was breathtaking, exactly the kind of wilderness solitude Dr. Winters had prescribed. So why did I suddenly want to turn around and head back to civilization? I shook off the feeling and continued across the meadow toward the lake. As I approached, I noticed something odd. A single tent was already set up along the shoreline. This was surprising, as I hadn't seen another soul since beginning my trek 3 days ago. The Continental Divide Trail wasn't exactly a popular route, especially this remote section in late September when the tourist season had wound down and the weather could turn treacherous with little warning. I approached the campsite cautiously. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The tent was a high-end model, forest green and expertly pitched. A small cooking setup was neatly arranged on a flat rock nearby, including a compact stove and a half-empty pot of what looked like reconstituted, freeze-dried pasta. A pair of hiking boots, men's size, I noted, sat outside the tent entrance and a weathered backpack leaned against a nearby tree. But there was no sign of the camper. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the surrounding slopes, but no human response followed. I felt a strange reluctance to set up my own camp nearby. Something about the abandoned-looking site triggered a deep unease. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The hiker was probably just off exploring, taking photos, or answering nature's call. I decided to continue around the lake to the far shore where I could still access water but have some distance from the mysterious campsite. As I circled the lake, I kept glancing back at the green tent, half expecting to see its occupant return. But the site remained still and empty. I found a suitable spot on the lake's eastern shore and efficiently set up my tent, secured my food in a bear canister, and prepared a simple dinner as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks to the west. The alpenglow turned the mountains a fiery orange-pink, reflecting in the perfectly still surface of Phantom Lake. It should have been serene. Instead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As darkness fell, I noticed there was no light coming from the green tent across the lake. No headlamp moving about, no cooking fire, nothing to indicate the return of its occupant. I told myself there were perfectly reasonable explanations. Maybe they had decided to push on to the next campsite. Maybe they were doing a night summit of one of the nearby peaks to see the stars. But then, why leave everything behind? The boots, the pack, the cooking equipment. Sleep did not come easily that night. The absolute darkness outside my tent seemed to press against the thin nylon walls, and every small sound, the rustling of my sleeping bag, the soft lapping of water on the shore, seemed magnified tenfold. I kept my headlamp close, switching it on periodically to reassure myself that my tent was still just my tent, that the shadows in the corners were just shadows. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, I jolted awake, though I couldn't say why. I lay perfectly still, listening. The silence was absolute for several long moments, and then I heard it, the scratching sound from the forest now directly outside my tent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A deliberate, rhythmic sound like something, running their fingernails along the tent fabric. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my headlamp with trembling fingers but hesitated to turn it on. Some primal instinct told me it was better not to reveal I was awake. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of my tent. I could track the sound as it circled me, by the door, then the left wall, then behind my head, then the right wall. A complete circuit. Then silence. I remained frozen, straining to hear anything beyond the thundering of my own heart. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Finally, I gathered my courage and switched on the headlamp, its beam cutting through the darkness inside my tent. I unzipped the door just enough to peer out. The night was clear, stars scattered across the black sky like spilled diamonds. The half-moon provided just enough light to make out the silhouettes of surrounding trees and the smooth surface of the lake beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I was about to retreat back into my sleeping bag when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the lake, the green tent was now illuminated from within, a soft glow indicating someone was inside. The camper had returned. I should have felt relieved. The mysterious absence explained, no more reason for unease. Instead, I felt a deepening sense of dread as I watched that softly glowing tent. Something about the quality of the light wasn't right. It wasn't the yellow-white of a headlamp or lantern. It was a sickly, greenish glow that seemed to pulse slightly, like a heartbeat. I zipped my tent closed and burrowed into my sleeping bag, keeping my headlamp on despite the drain on the batteries. I didn't sleep again that night. Dawn came with merciful slowness. I emerged from my tent into the gray half-light, stiff from tension and lack of sleep. The first thing I did was look across the lake to the other campsite. The green tent was gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. Nothing remained on the far shore but a circle of flattened grass where the tent had stood. No backpack against the tree, no cooking equipment on the rock, no boots outside a non-existent tent door. I broke camp in record time, my hand shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into its compression sack and collapsed my tent poles. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct screamed at me to leave this place. I would abandon my planned route and take the shortest trail back to the trailhead where I'd parked my car. According to my map, there was a ranger station at a place called Elk Creek, about 10 miles east. If I pushed hard, I could reach it by late afternoon. I shouldered my pack and set off at a brisk pace, eager to put Phantom Lake behind me. The day was clear and bright, the sky a perfect Colorado blue. Under different circumstances, I would have reveled in the spectacular mountain scenery. Instead, I kept my eyes on the trail and my ears alert for any unusual sounds. The scratching had not returned, but I couldn't shake the memory of it circling my tent in the darkness. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a trail junction. A weathered wooden sign indicated that the left fork led to Elk Creek Ranger Station, 7 miles. The right fork continued along the Continental Divide Trail, my original route. I turned left without hesitation. The trail descended steadily through alpine meadows before entering another dense forest of spruce and fir. The trees here were older, massive trunks soaring skyward, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Beautiful, yes, but the semi-darkness made me uneasy after my experience at Phantom Lake. Midday came and went. I stopped briefly to eat an energy bar and consult my map. I should have been getting close to Elk Creek, but the trail showed no signs of opening up or leading to any kind of station or outpost. I pushed on, a growing sense of disorientation nagging at me. By late afternoon, I knew something was wrong. According to my map and the mileage I'd covered, I should have reached the ranger station hours ago. Instead, the trail continued to wind through endless forest, each section looking eerily similar to the last. Had I somehow missed a turnoff? Taken a wrong fork at an unmarked junction? I stopped and pulled out my satellite emergency beacon, contemplating whether to activate it. It was designed for life-threatening emergencies, and while I was increasingly unnerved, I wasn't in immediate danger. Being lost and spooked didn't qualify. I tucked it back into my pack's top pocket, easily accessible if things got worse. I decided to continue for another hour. If I didn't reach the ranger station by then, I would find a suitable campsite, spend one more night in the wilderness, and reassess in the morning. That's when I saw the backpack. It was propped against a tree just off the trail, a weathered pack with a distinctive red rain cover partially draped over it. My step faltered as recognition dawned. It was identical to the pack I'd seen at the campsite by Phantom Lake, the one that had vanished along with the green tent by morning. I approached slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The backpack showed signs of exposure to the elements, a light coating of dust, a few pine needles stuck to the fabric. It looked as if it had been there for days, not hours. Impossible, given that I'd seen it just last night, miles away at a completely different location. I stood frozen, staring at the pack, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when the scratching started again. It came from behind me this time, a deliberate, rhythmic sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I whirled around, scanning the trees, the trail, the underbrush. Nothing moved in the absolute stillness of the forest. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding thin and frightened even to my own ears. "This isn't funny." The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, a low, wet chuckle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck as the laugh faded into a whispering voice. Emily. My name. My actual name that I hadn't shared with anyone on this trip because I hadn't met anyone. The voice knew my name. That was enough. I fumbled for the emergency beacon, my fingers clumsy with fear. As I pulled it from my pack, a hand closed over mine, pale, dirt-encrusted, with blackened fingernails worn to jagged points from scratching. I screamed and jerked away, dropping both the beacon and my pack as I stumbled backward. Standing before me was a man, or what had once been a man. He wore tattered hiking clothes, his frame gaunt to the point of emaciation. His skin had a grayish cast, and his eyes were wrong, filmed over with a milky greenish tint that matched the strange glow I'd seen in the tent. "You shouldn't be here, Emily," he said, his voice a dry rasp like dead leaves blowing across stone. "No one should be here." What are you?" I managed to stammer, continuing to back away. "My name was Daniel Carter," the figure said. "I was a ranger at Elk Creek Station. I came to investigate reports of hikers going missing along this section of trail." His head tilted at an unnatural angle as he studied me. "That was in 1987. My mind reeled. 1987? That was over 35 years ago. The man standing before me couldn't be more than 40. "That's not possible," I whispered. The thing that called itself Daniel Carter smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Phantom Lake doesn't appear on any official trail maps. Emily. It doesn't exist, except for those it chooses to reveal itself to. Those it hungers for." As he spoke, I noticed movement behind him. More figures emerging from the trees. Men and women in hiking gear from different eras, all with the same emaciated frames, the same milky green eyes, the same blackened, pointed fingernails. Some looked relatively recent, their Gore-Tex jackets and modern boots still recognizable despite their decay. Others wore clothing so dated and rotted that it barely clung to their withered forms. "The lake feeds on fear," Daniel continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather, "on isolation, on grief." His gaze seemed to pierce through me. "Your grief for Mark is a feast, Emily. The lake has been drawing you here for months, whispering to you in your dreams." A cold shock ran through me. I had been dreaming of a mountain lake for months after Mark's death. Dreams so vivid that I'd researched Colorado hiking trails upon waking, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the San Juans. I'd attributed it to my subconscious pushing me toward healing, toward the wilderness therapy that Dr. Winters would eventually suggest. But what if it had been something else? Something drawing me here for its own purposes? "The scratching," I said, a horrible realization dawning. "It's how you mark your victims." Daniel nodded approvingly. "The old ones scratch their claim into your shelter, your skin, your soul. Once marked, you belong to the lake. You become part of it. Part of us." He took a step toward me, and I saw that the fingernails of his right hand were worn down to bloody quicks. He had been the one scratching outside my tent. "Your husband waits for you, Emily," he said softly. "The lake has shown him to us. He's trapped between worlds, but you can join him. Don't you want to see Mark again?" At the mention of Mark's name from this abomination's lips, something snapped inside me. Grief had been my constant companion for a year, a weight that threatened to pull me under. But in this moment, it crystallized into a different emotion entirely. Rage. "You don't get to say his name," I hissed, reaching for the trekking pole I'd dropped when I backed away. "You don't know anything about him. Or me." Daniel's milky eyes widened slightly, perhaps surprised by my sudden shift from fear to fury. The other figures had formed a loose circle around us, watching with those same unsettling eyes. "We know everything about you, Emily," he said. "The lake shows us. It showed us how you blamed yourself for the accident. How you wish you'd been the one driving that night instead of Mark. How you sometimes think you deserve to die too." Each word struck like a physical blow because they were true. The guilt had been as crushing as the grief. If I hadn't asked Mark to pick me up from that late client meeting, if I had just called a rideshare instead, he would never have been on that icy road when the truck lost control. But something else was true too. Mark would be furious if I gave up now. I gripped the trekking pole tighter. "Mark would want me to live," I said, my voice stronger now. "And I'm not dying in this godforsaken forest to feed whatever nightmare you serve." I lunged forward suddenly, driving the pointed end of the trekking pole into Daniel's chest with all my strength. It sank in with surprising ease, as if his body had the consistency of rotted wood. He made a sound, not of pain, but of surprise, as a thick, greenish-black fluid began to ooze from the wound. The other figures surged forward with inhuman shrieks. I abandoned my pack and the emergency beacon, knowing there was no time to retrieve them. Instead, I grabbed my second trekking pole and ran, crashing through the underbrush away from the trail. I had no plan beyond putting distance between myself and those things, finding somewhere to hide until I could figure out my next move. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, stumbling down a steep, rocky slope into a narrow ravine. A small stream trickled along its bottom, and I followed it downhill, reasoning that water always eventually led to civilization. The shrieks had faded behind me, but I didn't slow my pace. I knew instinctively that those things wouldn't give up easily, not after marking me as their prey. As the ravine widened into a proper creek bed, I spotted something that made me stumble to a halt, a small wooden structure half hidden among the trees on the opposite bank. A cabin or shed of some kind, weathered gray with age but obviously human-made. I splashed across the shallow creek and approached cautiously. The single door hung partially open on rusted hinges. No windows were visible from this angle. It could be a trap, of course, but with the sun already dipping toward the western peaks, I needed shelter for the coming night. "Hello?" I called softly, poised to run if anything emerged. No response. I used my remaining trekking pole to push the door open further, wincing at the screech of hinges. The interior was dim but not completely dark thanks to a small hole in the roof that admitted a shaft of late afternoon sunlight. Dust motes danced in the beam, swirling as the disturbed air from the door circulated through the single room. It appeared to be an old ranger or Forest Service cabin, long abandoned. A rustic table and a single chair sat against one wall. A metal-framed cot with a bare, stained mattress occupied the opposite corner. Shelves lined the rear wall, mostly empty save for a few cans so rusted their labels had disintegrated, and a kerosene lantern thick with dust. But what drew my attention immediately was the wall above the table, where dozens, no, hundreds, of Polaroid photographs had been tacked up in a chaotic collage. Even in the dim light, I could make out that they were all variations on the same image. Phantom Lake, photographed from different angles, in different seasons, across what must have been decades based on the varying states of deterioration of the photos themselves. I stepped closer, my skin crawling. In each photo, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it, was a dark shape beneath the lake's surface. A massive, shadowy presence that seemed to shift its form from image to image. A logbook lay open on the table beneath the photo wall, its pages yellow with age. The handwriting on the visible page was jagged. Desperate. Oct. 3, 1987. 3rd Patrol in search of missing hikers. Keep finding myself back at the lake despite trying to navigate away. Maps useless. Compass spins randomly. The scratching kept me awake all night. Something in the water. Something under the water. It watches. It waits. It knows. The entry was signed Ranger D. Carter. My blood ran cold. Daniel Carter. The thing in the forest with the filed teeth and milky eyes had once been this man, a ranger who'd come looking for missing hikers only to become one himself. I flipped through more pages of the journal, finding increasingly erratic entries documenting Carter's descent into paranoia and fear as the lake's influence grew stronger. The final entry, dated October 17, 1987, consisted of a single line. "It's too late for me, but others must be warned. The lake is hungry." Below this was a crude map drawn in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. It showed Phantom Lake at its center with various trails radiating outward like a spider's web. One trail was circled repeatedly and marked with an X at its end. Next to the X was written, "True path, 3 miles east to highway." I stared at the map, trying to memorize its details in the fading light. If this was accurate, I was much closer to civilization than I'd thought. The highway marker corresponded roughly to where my car was parked at the official trailhead, just 3 miles east. A sound outside the cabin made me freeze, the familiar scratch, scratch, scratch on the exterior wall. They had found me. I looked around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon or barricade. The kerosene lantern caught my eye. I grabbed it, finding it still half full of fuel after all these years. A box of matches lay nearby, ancient but potentially still functional in the dry mountain air. The scratching intensified, now coming from multiple points around the cabin. Through cracks in the wooden walls, I could see movement outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into rapid darkness. I had only minutes before I would be trapped in here with no light at all. I struck a match, relieved when it flared to life, and lit the lantern. Its warm glow filled the small space, and immediately the scratching outside became more frenzied, accompanied by hisses of what sounded like pain or aversion. They didn't like the light. I held the lantern higher, moving toward the door, which still stood partially open. Through the gap, I could see them now. 5 or 6 figures lurking just beyond the pool of lantern light, their green eyes reflecting the flame like those of predatory animals. Daniel was at their center, the wound in his chest still seeping that thick, dark fluid. "You can't escape the lake, Emily," he called, his voice like stones grinding together. "No one ever truly leaves Phantom Lake. It's already inside you." "Watch me," I replied, then kicked the door fully open and charged forward, holding the lantern before me like a shield. The figures scattered with inhuman shrieks, retreating from the light. I ran, following what I hoped was an easterly direction based on the crude map and the position of the rising moon. The lantern swung wildly in my grip, its circle of protection wavering but holding. I could hear them pursuing, crashing through the underbrush just beyond the light's reach. Occasionally, one would dart closer, a pale shape at the edge of my vision, but the lantern kept them at bay. For now. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, the terrain gradually sloping downward as I left the high country behind. The trees began to thin, and ahead I could make out what appeared to be a road cut through the forest, the highway. Freedom was so close I could taste it. That's when the lantern sputtered and died, its ancient fuel finally exhausted. Darkness engulfed me instantly. I stood frozen, listening to the sounds of my pursuers closing in from all sides. The scratching began again, all around me now, a maddening chorus of sharp nails on wood, on stone, on my very soul, it seemed. "We told you, Emily." Daniel's voice came from directly behind me. "No one escapes." I felt cold fingers on the back of my neck, those filed nails pricking my skin. I closed my eyes, thinking of Mark, wishing I could apologize one last time for sending him out on that icy night. A sudden brightness cut through my closed eyelids. A familiar sound reached my ears, the rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on asphalt. Headlights. My eyes flew open to see a pickup truck rounding the bend on the highway, its high beams cutting through the darkness like a blade. The fingers at my neck recoiled as if burned, and the air filled with those same inhuman shrieks I'd heard in the forest. I ran, waving my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck slowed, then stopped. An older man in a Colorado Parks Department uniform leaned out the driver's window, his face concerned. "Miss, are you all right? What are you doing out here in the dark?" I looked back over my shoulder. The forest stood dark and still. No pale figures with filed teeth and milky eyes. No Daniel Carter with his warnings and threats. Just trees and shadows. I got lost," I stammered, turning back to the ranger. "I've been hiking in the San Juans and took a wrong turn somewhere." He nodded sympathetically. "Happens more often than you'd think up here. The trails can get confusing if you don't know them well. Hop in. I'll give you a lift to your car if it's at one of the trailheads." I climbed into the passenger seat, relief washing over me in a wave so powerful I nearly wept. As the ranger put the truck in gear and continued down the highway, I allowed myself to believe I had escaped, that the nightmare was over. "Where exactly were you hiking?" he asked conversationally as we drove. "I know these mountains like the back of my hand." "I was on the Continental Divide Trail," I replied, "but I think I strayed off it somehow. I ended up at a lake that wasn't on my map. Phantom Lake, I think it was called." The truck swerved suddenly as the ranger's head snapped toward me, his face pale in the dashboard light. "That's not possible," he said, his voice tight. "There is no Phantom Lake." "But I was there," I insisted. "I camped by it. There was another tent." "Miss," he interrupted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, "I've worked these mountains for 30 years. I know every lake, every trail, every rock in the San Juans. There is no Phantom Lake. There never was." We drove in silence after that, the ranger occasionally glancing at me with what looked like fear in his eyes. When we reached my car at the trailhead, he waited until I'd unlocked it and stowed my remaining gear before pulling away with a spray of gravel, clearly eager to be rid of me. I sat in my car for a long time, hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Some kind of altitude-induced hallucination or psychological break triggered by grief? But then I noticed something on the passenger seat next to me that I hadn't put there. A single Polaroid photograph, faded and yellow with age. I picked it up with shaking fingers and held it up to the dome light. It showed Phantom Lake on what appeared to be a perfect summer day, its surface mirror-smooth under a cloudless sky. And there, captured in the moment the photo was taken, was a dark shape beneath the surface, massive and somehow wrong, its outline suggesting something not quite solid, not quite tangible. I turned the photo over. Written on the back in a jagged hand I recognized from the cabin logbook were 5 words: "The lake is always hungry." Below that, in fresher ink, as if recently added, "We'll be waiting, Emily." I drove home to Denver that night, pushing the speed limit the entire way, irrationally afraid that if I stopped, if I closed my eyes even for a moment, I would find myself back on the shore of that impossible lake with its hungry depths and those who served it. It's been 10 months since my wilderness therapy in the San Juans. I never told Dr. Winters what happened. How could I? She'd have me committed. Instead, I told her the trip had been rejuvenating. Transformative even. In a way, that wasn't a lie. I've moved on from my grief for Mark, not because I've processed it or worked through it, but because it's been replaced by a different kind of burden. The Polaroid sits in my desk drawer, a constant reminder that what I experienced was real, no matter how impossible. Sometimes at night I wake to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window, soft, rhythmic, patient. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I never look. I know what I would see if I did. Pale faces with milky green eyes, hungry smiles full of filed teeth, blackened fingernails worn to points. They're waiting for me to return to the lake. And the most terrifying part? Sometimes I want to. In my dreams, Mark is there now, standing knee-deep in those dark waters, reaching out to me with a loving smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, his milky green eyes. Dr. Winters says I'm making excellent progress in my grief journey. She doesn't know that every day is a battle not to pack my car and drive back to those mountains to find that impossible lake again, to join Mark and Daniel and all the others who serve the hungry depths. The lake knows my name. It knows my grief. It knows I'll return eventually. After all, no one ever truly escapes Phantom Lake. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the most remote part of Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, Colorado, last summer. "Come on, Will, we're burning daylight." Jake's voice echoed through the trees as I double-checked my backpack for the 3rd time. "Almost ready," I called back, zipping up the final compartment. This was supposed to be our escape, a 4-day hiking trip to decompress from the crushing weight of corporate life. Jake had been my closest friend since college, and when he suggested this expedition to Black Canyon, I jumped at the chance. After my divorce finalized last month, I desperately needed the distraction. I shouldered my pack and joined Jake and our third companion Marcus at the trailhead. The three of us made an unlikely hiking group. Jake, the seasoned outdoorsman with his meticulously organized gear. Marcus, the tech guy who'd rather be gaming but came along for male bonding. And me, somewhere in between, athletic enough to keep up but nervous about the remoteness of our destination. About time, Marcus grinned, adjusting his designer sunglasses that seemed comically out of place against the rugged backdrop. I've already counted 16 mosquito bites. The Warner Point Trail should lead us to that secluded camping area I told you about, Jake said, consulting his GPS. It's not on any official maps, but I found it mentioned in an old hiking forum. Supposedly has the best views in the entire park. I felt my phone vibrate and pulled it out to see my ex-wife's name lighting up the screen. With a quick swipe, I silenced it and shoved it deep into my pocket. Not today, Melissa. Not here. Everything good? Jake asked, noticing my expression. Yeah, just work, I lied, forcing a smile. Lead the way, mountain man. The first few hours of hiking were exactly what I needed. The physical exertion pushing all thoughts of failed marriages and career disappointments from my mind. The Black Canyon lived up to its reputation, with sheer cliff walls plunging dramatically into darkness below. The Gunnison River was barely visible at the bottom, a silver thread winding through a narrow gash in the earth. By mid-afternoon, Jake led us off the main trail, following what appeared to be a barely visible deer path. Are you sure about this? I asked, noticing how the vegetation seemed to close in around us. The ranger at the visitor center didn't mention any trails out here. Jake waved his hand dismissively. That's because they don't want every tourist trampling through. Trust me, the place I found is worth it. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow. How much further? My feet are killing me. Another hour, maybe less, Jake replied, checking his GPS again. Weird, the signal's getting spotty. I glanced at my own phone. No service bars. Not unusual in remote areas, but something about the sudden isolation made my skin prickle with unease. The path grew steeper and less defined as we pushed forward. Several times I nearly lost my footing on loose rocks that seemed to shift unnaturally under my boots. The forest around us changed too, the trees growing denser, their trunks darker and more gnarled. Even the birdsong that had accompanied us earlier had fallen silent. Does it seem quieter to you guys? Marcus asked, voicing my exact thoughts. Jake shrugged. That's what real wilderness sounds like. No cars, no people, no distractions. But it wasn't just quiet. It was a suffocating silence that seemed to press against my eardrums, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We should be there soon, Jake muttered, squinting at his GPS. Damn thing keeps glitching. The trail suddenly opened to a small clearing, perfectly circular, as if carved deliberately into the forest. At its center stood a massive dead pine, its bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. This is it? Marcus asked, disappointment evident in his voice. Jake frowned, turning in a slow circle. No, this isn't right. The place I found should have a view of the canyon. I dropped my pack and approached the dead tree. Its bark was blackened, not as if burned, but as if infected with some dark substance. When I reached out to touch it, my fingers came away stained with something that looked like oil but smelled metallic, like old blood. Guys, I called, wiping my hand on my pants, something's not right about this place. No kidding, Marcus replied, pointing at the ground. Look at this. Surrounding the tree in a perfect circle were small cairns, stacks of stones balanced precariously on top of each other. I counted 12 of them, evenly spaced. Probably just left by other hikers, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. I knelt beside one of the cairns, noticing something odd. These stones, they're not from around here. The rocks were smooth and white, like river stones, but we were nowhere near water. Marcus pulled out his camera. This is actually pretty cool. Creepy, but cool. As he raised the lens to snap a photo, his camera emitted a high-pitched whine before shutting off. What the hell? "Battery probably died," Jake said, but he was staring uneasily at the cairns. I stood up, suddenly feeling lightheaded. "We should keep moving. Find a proper campsite before dark." Jake nodded, checking his watch. "Sunset's in about 2 hours. Let's try heading west. We should hit the canyon edge eventually." As we gathered our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something staring back. Nothing moved, yet the sensation persisted, a crawling unease on the back of my neck. We abandoned the clearing, pushing through dense underbrush where no trail existed. Jake took the lead, occasionally consulting his GPS despite its unreliability. After 30 minutes of difficult hiking, the trees began to thin, and the sound of wind whipping through the canyon reached us. "See? What did I tell you?" Jake grinned triumphantly as we emerged onto a rocky outcropping overlooking the canyon. The view was breathtaking. The setting sun casting the opposite wall in shades of gold and crimson, the shadows deepening the already black depths below. "I take back everything I said," Marcus admitted, gazing at the vista. "This is worth the blisters." We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents on the flattest section of the outcropping and gathering firewood before darkness fell. As night descended, the temperature dropped rapidly and we huddled around the campfire, passing a flask of whiskey between us. "To escaping the rat race," Jake toasted, raising the flask before taking a swig. "To forgetting what needs forgetting," I added, accepting the flask and taking a long pull. The liquor burned pleasantly down my throat. "To not getting eaten by bears," Marcus concluded, earning laughs from both of us. The conversation flowed easily as stars appeared overhead, brilliant and numerous without city lights to dim them. For the first time in months, I felt the tightness in my chest begin to loosen. This was exactly what I needed. Friendship, wilderness, and distance from my problems. Around midnight, as the fire burned low, we retired to our tents. Exhausted from the day's hike, I fell asleep almost immediately, my sleeping bag cocoon-like around me. I woke suddenly, disoriented, with no idea how long I'd been asleep. The inside of my tent was pitch black, and an unnatural silence pressed against my ears. Even the wind had died completely. I reached for my phone to check the time, but it was dead despite having over 70% battery when I'd turned in. Something had woken me. A sound, perhaps, or simply that animal instinct that alerts us to danger. I lay still, listening intently. Nothing. Then, so faint I might have imagined it, came a gentle scraping sound from outside, like stone sliding against stone. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The scraping came again, slightly louder. It was real. "Jake," I whispered, hoping my friend was moving around outside. No response. Unzipping my tent as quietly as possible, I peered out. The night was clear, moonlight illuminating our campsite in silvery light. The fire had died to embers. Jake and Marcus's tents stood undisturbed, but something was wrong. It took my sleep-fogged brain a moment to process what I was seeing. Stone cairns, identical to those in the clearing, now surrounded our campsite in a perfect circle. 12 of them, evenly spaced, gleaming white in the moonlight. They hadn't been there when we went to sleep. My heart began to pound as I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, yet that sensation of being watched returned tenfold. I scrambled out of my tent and crossed to Jake's, hissing his name as I shook the fabric. "Jake, wake up!" After a moment, his sleepy voice responded. "Will, what time is it? Get out here, now." Something in my tone must have conveyed the urgency because Jake emerged moments later, hunting knife in hand. "What's wrong?" I pointed silently at the cairns. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What the fuck?" he breathed, turning in a slow circle. "Those weren't there before." "I know." "Should we wake Marcus?" Jake asked, gripping his knife tighter. "Yeah." But when we approached Marcus's tent, we found it empty. His sleeping bag was there, unzipped and thrown aside as if he'd gotten up in a hurry. His boots were gone, but his phone and headlamp remained. "Marcus," Jake called, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No answer came. "Maybe he went to take a leak," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Why would he leave his headlamp? We searched the immediate area, calling Marcus's name with increasing urgency. The edge of the outcropping was disconcertingly close, a sheer drop into blackness. "You don't think he—" Jake couldn't finish the sentence. I shook my head. No way. We would have heard something. As we stood there, debating what to do, I noticed something glinting near one of the cairns. I approached cautiously and found Marcus's designer sunglasses, one lens cracked, resting atop the white stones. They hadn't been there minutes ago. "Jake," I called, my voice trembling slightly. He joined me, cursing under his breath when he saw the glasses. "This isn't right. This isn't fucking right." A twig snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, Jake raising his knife defensively. "Marcus!" I called, straining to see into the darkness beyond the trees. For a long moment, nothing. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Marcus, walking stiffly, his movements jerky and unnatural. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by concern. "Marcus, you okay, man?" He didn't respond, just continued walking toward us with that strange, puppet-like gait. As he came closer, moonlight revealed his face, expressionless, eyes wide and unblinking. "Marcus," Jake stepped forward. "What's going on? Where did you go?" When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of its usual animation. "I saw someone in the woods, a woman. She was crying." Jake and I exchanged glances. "What woman? There's no one else out here." Marcus's blank gaze moved past us to the cairns. "She told me about the hollow ones. They're coming now. They're hungry." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "Marcus, you're freaking us out. This isn't funny." His head tilted at an odd angle. "She called me by name. She knew all our names." Jake grabbed Marcus's shoulders. "Snap out of it, man. What happened to you?" For the first time, Marcus's expression changed, a smile spreading across his face, too wide, revealing far too many teeth. "She's coming. She wants to meet you too." Jake released him, stepping back. "Will, grab the emergency kit from my pack. He's having some kind of episode." I reluctantly turned away, hurrying to Jake's tent. Behind me, I heard Jake continue trying to reason with Marcus. As I rummaged through Jake's meticulously organized backpack for the first aid kit, the voices outside changed tone. Jake's rose in alarm, then cut off abruptly. I froze, listening. Silence. Then a wet, gurgling sound that raised the hair on my arms. "Jake?" I called, abandoning the pack and moving toward the tent entrance. No response, just that terrible liquid gurgling. I hesitated, every instinct screaming danger. Through the tent opening, I could make out two figures silhouetted against the night sky. One standing, one kneeling. As I watched, the kneeling figure slowly toppled sideways. Heart hammering in my chest, I grabbed Jake's hunting knife from where he'd left it on his sleeping bag and stepped outside. The scene that greeted me will haunt me until my dying day. Jake lay on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Standing over him was Marcus, but not Marcus. His body rigid, head still tilted at that impossible angle, hands darkened with what could only be blood. When he turned to face me, his eyes reflected the moonlight like a wild animal's. "Marcus," I whispered, raising the knife defensively. "What did you do?" His too wide smile returned. "I'm not Marcus anymore. Marcus is with the Hollow Ones now, just like your friend here will be." He prodded Jake with his foot. Jake moaned weakly. "I should have run. I should have fled into the forest and never looked back." But Jake was still alive, and whatever had happened to Marcus, I couldn't abandon my friends. "Stay back," I warned, trying to edge toward Jake. Marcus, or the thing wearing Marcus's face, laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "The old woman of the canyon has waited so long for new vessels. Your bodies will serve her well." He lunged suddenly, moving with unnatural speed. I slashed wildly with the knife, feeling it connect with something solid. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the wound as he grabbed my wrist, squeezing with crushing strength until the knife fell from my numb fingers. His other hand shot out, closing around my throat. "She'll take you last," he hissed, his breath smelling of rot and stagnant water. "She wants you to watch your friends change first." Spots danced before my eyes as his grip tightened. In desperation, I drove my knee upward, connecting solidly with his groin. Marcus might have been possessed or insane, but his body was still human. He doubled over, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, and my heel caught on one of the stone cairns. I fell hard, the structure collapsing beneath me. As the white stones scattered, Marcus let out an inhuman shriek of rage. "The circle is broken," he howled, his voice no longer his own, deeper, layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. The other cairns began to vibrate, the stones rattling against each other. The air temperature plummeted so rapidly that my next breath emerged as vapor. Marcus convulsed, his body contorting in ways that should have been impossible, bones cracking audibly. I scrambled to Jake, who lay pale and still, blood soaking his shirt. "Jake! Jake, stay with me!" I pressed my hand against the wound in his chest, trying to stem the bleeding. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Will, run. It's not just Marcus. The stones." A howling wind suddenly whipped through our campsite, though the trees remained eerily still. The scattered stones from the cairn I'd knocked over began to move, skittering across the ground like living things. I watched in horror as they gathered around Marcus's contorted form, climbing up his legs, adhering to his skin. Jake's hand weakly grasped mine. The old woman. Local legend. Takes hikers, makes them hollow. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "We need to get out of here," I urged, trying to help him up. "Can you walk?" He shook his head slightly, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Too late for me. Go. Destroy the cairns. Only way." Marcus, or what had been Marcus, was now half covered in the white stones, his shape changing, elongating. The remaining cairns vibrated more violently, small stones breaking free and flying toward him as if magnetized. I made a split-second decision. Leaving Jake, I lunged toward the nearest intact cairn, kicking it with all my strength. The stones scattered and another inhuman shriek filled the air. I didn't stop, moving to the next cairn and the next, destroying each one methodically. With each cairn I demolished, the wind grew stronger and the creature that had been Marcus seemed to struggle, as if being pulled in different directions. By the time I reached the final cairn, the thing was screeching continuously, a sound that threatened to burst my eardrums. I hesitated at the last cairn, watching as the creature thrashed, now almost completely encased in white stone except for its face, still recognizable as Marcus but twisted in fury. Those reflective eyes locked onto mine. "Stop," it commanded, Marcus's voice briefly breaking through the deeper tones. "Will, please, it's me. I'm fighting it." For a moment I faltered, seeing my friend's desperate expression. But then I remembered Jake, bleeding out on the ground. "You're not Marcus," I snarled and kicked the final cairn with every ounce of strength I possessed. As the stones scattered, a deafening crack split the air, like the earth itself breaking open. The creature unleashed a wail of such despair and rage that I fell to my knees, hands pressed against my ears. The white stones covering it began to glow, growing brighter until I had to shield my eyes. Through my fingers, I glimpsed the thing that had been Marcus changing once more, its form elongating impossibly, limbs stretching and multiplying. The light intensified to unbearable brightness, and with a sound like a thunderclap, it simply collapsed. The glowing stones fell to the ground, immediately turning black and crumbling to dust that the wind carried away. Where Marcus had stood, nothing remained. The unnatural wind died as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving an ordinary night, stars twinkling innocently overhead. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by normal forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hooting of an owl. I rushed back to Jake, who lay motionless, eyes closed. "Jake! Jake! Can you hear me?" I pressed trembling fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. "No, no, no," I muttered, beginning chest compressions. "Don't do this. Don't you dare." I continued CPR until my arms shook with exhaustion, but Jake never responded. Eventually, I had to accept the truth. He was gone. Slumping back, numb with shock and grief, I noticed a faint light coming from my tent. My phone, which had been dead earlier, was now functioning, the screen glowing. I crawled toward it, my body moving mechanically. The phone showed full battery and, miraculously, 1 bar of service. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. What followed is mostly a blur in my memory. I remember the operator's voice sounding impossibly normal as I tried to explain our location. I remember waiting as dawn broke, sitting between Jake's body and the empty space where Marcus had vanished. I remember the rescue helicopter's searchlight sweeping the outcropping, the paramedics' grim faces, the police officers' skeptical expressions as I tried to tell them what happened. They found no trace of Marcus, no footprints leading away from the campsite, no body at the bottom of the canyon. Nothing. They found no white stones, no cairns, no evidence of anything supernatural. Just a campsite, a dead body with a knife wound, and a raving survivor. The official report ruled Jake's death a homicide, with Marcus as the prime suspect, presumed to have fled into the wilderness or fallen to his death in the canyon. They searched for weeks but found nothing. I was initially a suspect too, but the defensive wounds on my throat and the fact that the knife wound couldn't have been self-inflicted eventually cleared me. No one believed my story about the old woman of the canyon or the Hollow Ones. Not the police, not the park rangers, not the therapist I was eventually required to see. They attributed my delusions to trauma and possible oxygen deprivation from being choked. I tried researching after I was released from the hospital. The Old Woman of the Canyon appears in some obscure local folklore, a witch who supposedly made a deal with dark spirits to extend her life, taking the bodies of unwary travelers who ventured too deep into her territory. The Hollow Ones were said to be her servants, empty shells of former victims. Most accounts dismissed it as a story invented to keep children from wandering too far from home. It's been a year now. I haven't been hiking since, haven't even set foot in a national park. I dream about that night constantly. Jake's blood on my hands, Marcus's too wide smile, those white stones moving with purpose. Sometimes I wake convinced that my body isn't my own anymore, that something else is wearing me like a suit. Last week, I received a postcard. No return address, no message. Just a picture of Black Canyon of the Gunnison and 12 small white stones arranged in a circle, meticulously balanced on each other. The postmark was from a small town just outside the park. I burned it immediately, but it was too late, because now I can feel it. The weight of someone else's gaze on me at all times, the sensation of being watched, being hunted, and sometimes when I pass mirrors, I catch myself smiling a little too widely, my head tilted at an angle that isn't quite natural. I know what it means. The old woman isn't finished with me. The circle may have been broken that night, but it's forming again, stone by patient stone, and I don't know how much longer I can keep her out. My name is Emily Hall, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the spring of 2024, during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo hiking trip in the Black Forest region of Colorado. I've always been a city girl at heart, but after my divorce from Mark last year, I needed space to breathe. to rediscover who I was outside of our 8-year relationship. My therapist suggested connecting with nature might help heal the emotional wounds still festering beneath the surface. Solitude can be clarifying, she'd said. I wish I'd understood then just how terrifying true solitude could be. Black Forest, a densely wooded area northeast of Colorado Springs, seemed perfect for my first extended solo hiking trip. Not too remote for a beginner like me, but secluded enough to provide the quiet reflection I desperately needed. I'd meticulously planned a 3-day excursion along the Section 16 trail before connecting to the Palmer Divide, with a small detour to visit the infamous Black Forest Cemetery, a historical site I'd read about online. The drive from Denver took about an hour and a half. As I left the highway and navigated the winding county roads, the landscape gradually transformed. Suburban developments gave way to scattered ranches, which eventually surrendered to the dense ponderosa pines that give the Black Forest its name. The trees stood like sentinels against the blue Colorado sky, their dark needles contrasting sharply with their ruddy trunks. I arrived at the trailhead parking lot around noon. Only 2 other cars were there, a good sign that I'd have the solitude I was craving. I double-checked my backpack. Tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, water purifier, 3 days of dehydrated meals, extra layers, headlamp, map, compass, and my fully charged phone with the trail GPS downloaded. Everything was in order. As I locked my car and adjusted my pack's straps across my shoulders, a pickup truck pulled into the lot. An elderly man with leathery skin and a silver mustache rolled down his window. "Heading out alone?" he called, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed my equipment. "Yes," I replied, "just for a few days. I'll be staying on the main trails." He nodded slowly. "Weather's supposed to turn on the second night. Make sure you've got good rain gear." He paused, then added, "And maybe avoid the old cemetery area after dark. Lots of sinkholes around there. Dangerous terrain." I thanked him for the advice, though I inwardly rolled my eyes. I'd researched the weather extensively. There was only a 20% chance of light showers, hardly the turn he was describing. As for the cemetery warning, it smacked of small-town superstition. Still, I smiled politely before heading toward the trailhead. The first day of hiking was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through stands of ponderosa pines, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of Pikes Peak in the distance. The spring wildflowers were beginning to bloom, dotting the forest floor with splashes of color. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and birdsong accompanied my steady footfalls on the soft earth. I made good time, covering about 7 miles before deciding to make camp in a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail. I'd passed only 3 other hikers the entire day, exchanging brief greetings before continuing on our separate ways. As I set up my tent and gathered wood for a small fire, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed: simplicity, self-reliance, and the quiet rhythm of nature. As twilight descended, I heated water for my freeze-dried pasta dinner and watched the flames of my small campfire dance against the gathering darkness. The first stars appeared overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air. I'd forgotten how many stars you could see away from city lights. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound like distant singing, carried on the evening breeze. It was faint enough that I initially thought it might be other campers, though I hadn't seen any signs of them. The melody was strange, almost discordant with words I couldn't make out. I strained to listen, but as quickly as it had come, the sound faded. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks or perhaps some nocturnal bird I wasn't familiar with. After cleaning up from dinner and hanging my food bag from a tree branch away from my tent — bears were common in the area — I crawled into my sleeping bag. Despite the hard ground beneath my thin sleeping pad, exhaustion quickly pulled me under. I dreamt of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. Every time I glanced back, there was nothing there, yet the sensation of being hunted intensified. I woke with a gasp around 3 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest was utterly silent. No wind, no animals, not even the rustle of leaves. Just a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness of my tent. Nothing was amiss, but sleep eluded me for the next hour. When I finally drifted off again, my dreams were mercifully blank. Dawn brought normality with it. Birdsong, gentle breezes, and the soft golden light filtering through the canopy. I felt silly about my middle-of-the-night anxiety as I boiled water for instant coffee and oatmeal. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, not threatening at all. I broke camp efficiently and continued on the trail by 8 a.m. My plan for the day was to hike another 6 miles, which would bring me near the perimeter of the old Black Forest Cemetery by afternoon. According to my research, the cemetery dated back to the late 1800s and contained the graves of the area's early settlers. Several online hiking forums mentioned it as an interesting historical detour. The morning passed pleasantly. The trail became more challenging as it ascended the Palmer Divide, but the exertion felt good. I stopped occasionally to drink water and take photos of particularly scenic vistas. Around noon, I paused for lunch on a fallen log, consulting my map. The cemetery should be less than a mile east of my current position, accessible via a narrow, unmarked path. After lunch, I located the faint trail and turned onto it. The path was overgrown in places, clearly less traveled than the main route. The trees seemed to grow denser here, blocking much of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight beneath their branches. I checked my phone's GPS to confirm I was heading in the right direction, but to my annoyance, I had no signal. Not entirely surprising in these remote woods. After about 20 minutes of hiking, the trees abruptly thinned, and I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. The Black Forest Cemetery lay before me, surrounded by a rusted wrought iron fence listing precariously in places. The graves were a mixture of modest headstones and more elaborate family monuments, all weathered by time and the harsh Colorado elements. I felt a flutter of excitement as I pushed open the creaking gate. There was something poignant about these forgotten resting places, these lives reduced to names and dates carved in stone. I moved slowly between the graves, reading inscriptions where they were still legible. Many of the deceased had died young. Children taken by disease, women in childbirth, men in mining accidents. Life had been brutal on the frontier. One family plot contained 5 small headstones, all children who had died within weeks of each other in the winter of 1883, likely from some epidemic. At the cemetery's back corner, partially hidden by an ancient juniper, stood the largest monument, a weathered angel with outstretched wings, perched atop a substantial granite base. The angel's face had been worn nearly smooth by decades of wind and rain, giving it a blank, eerie appearance. The name on the base read Eleanor Blackwood, 1845-1889. May she find the peace denied her in life. Something about the inscription sent a chill down my spine. I found myself wondering what had denied Eleanor peace during her lifetime. Looking more carefully at the base of the monument, I noticed strange symbols carved alongside the more traditional epitaph, curious spiraling patterns and what looked like a stylized eye. I was so absorbed in examining the unusual gravestone that I didn't immediately notice the dramatic shift in weather. Dark clouds had rolled in, obscuring the sun and bringing with them a sudden, unseasonable cold. The old man's warning about the weather turning echoed in my memory. Large drops of rain began to fall, quickly transforming into a steady downpour. I cursed under my breath. My rain gear was in my pack, which I'd left leaning against the cemetery fence. I hurried back toward the entrance, but as I reached the center of the graveyard, a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead made me jump. In that same instant, I could have sworn I heard laughter, a woman's laughter, high and brittle, mingling with the thunder. I spun around, but I was alone among the gravestones, now slick with rain. By the time I retrieved my pack and pulled on my rain jacket, I was already soaked through. The rain was falling in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Continuing my hike was out of the question. I needed to find shelter and wait out the storm. I remembered passing a small wooden structure about a quarter-mile back on the main trail, perhaps an old ranger station or trail maintenance shed. That would be better than pitching my tent in this deluge. Leaving the cemetery, I fought my way back through the increasingly muddy trail. The wind had picked up, whipping rain into my face and turning the temperature bitterly cold for May. My fingers were growing numb, and my sodden hiking boots squelched with each step. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, I spotted the small cabin through the rain. It was more dilapidated than I'd registered when passing it earlier. The roof sagged and one window was boarded over, but it was structure with a roof, and right now that was all that mattered. The door wasn't locked, just stuck from moisture and disuse. I had to throw my shoulder against it several times before it gave way with a groan of protesting wood. The interior was dim and musty, with dust motes dancing in the gray light that filtered through the single dirty window. The cabin consisted of one room with a small wood stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. It looked as though it had once been a line cabin for forest rangers but had been abandoned years ago. Surprisingly, there was a stack of firewood beside the stove, old but appeared dry enough. I stripped off my wet outer layers and hung them from a nail on the wall, hoping they might dry somewhat. After several attempts, I managed to get a small fire going in the wood stove. The warmth was heavenly against my chilled skin. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Thunder rumbled continuously, and the rain beat a relentless rhythm on the cabin's roof. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The battery was at 62%, so I turned it off to conserve power. According to my watch, it was only 3:30 p.m., though the sky outside was dark as dusk. With nothing else to do, I decided to heat water for tea on the wood stove and assess my supplies. If the storm continued through the night, I might need to sleep here rather than setting up my tent in the rain. As I waited for the water to heat, I noticed a small wooden chest pushed under the cot. Curiosity piqued, I pulled it out and tried the lid. It opened with a creak, revealing a jumble of items: an old Forest Service logbook, some rusted tools, a faded photograph, and what looked like a journal bound in cracked leather. I picked up the photograph first. Though yellowed with age, the image was still clear. A group of men in early 20th century Forest Service uniforms standing in front of this very cabin. They stared solemnly at the camera, as people often did in old photographs. However, something in the background caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing behind the men, partially obscured by trees, there appeared to be a figure in a long dress. The image was blurry, but it seemed to be a woman with long dark hair, her face a pale smudge. I set aside the photo and picked up the journal. The first pages were filled with mundane accounts of forest patrols, wildlife sightings, and weather reports, dated 1923. About halfway through, the entries became more personal, written by a ranger named Thomas Garrett. May 15th, 1923. Jenkins claims he saw her again last night, standing among the tombstones. I told him it was just moonlight on the mist, but he's convinced it's the Blackwood woman. These superstitious locals and their ghost stories are getting to him. May 20th, 1923. Heard the singing again last night. Jenkins says it's her, calling men into the woods. 3 hunters have gone missing in this area over the past year. The official report says they got lost and succumbed to exposure, but locals whisper otherwise. May 25th, 1923. Jenkins didn't return from his patrol. Found his pack near the cemetery, but no sign of him. The strange symbols were scratched into a tree nearby, the same ones from the Blackwood grave. Sheriff says he probably deserted his post, but I know Jenkins wouldn't leave without his gear. May 29th, 1923. I hear her singing every night now. Haven't slept in days. The locals say Eleanor Blackwood was hanged as a witch, but the town covered it up, calling it suicide. They say she promised to return for each of their descendants. I'm requesting a transfer tomorrow. There were no more entries after that. I closed the journal with shaking hands, suddenly aware of how dark the cabin had become as the storm-darkened afternoon waned toward evening. I added more wood to the stove, watching the flames leap higher, grateful for their light and warmth. I told myself the journal was nothing but the ramblings of an isolated man, probably driven to paranoia by the loneliness of his posting. The witch was just a local legend, embellished over time. Every small town had similar stories. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. At that same moment, the flames in the wood stove flickered violently, though there was no draft I could feel. And then I heard it, singing. The same distant, discordant melody I'd heard at my campsite the previous night, but closer now. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling with the wind. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The singing continued, and now I could almost make out words in a language I didn't recognize, guttural and rhythmic. I thought of Eleanor Blackwood's grave with its strange symbols and felt cold despite the fire's heat. "It's just the wind," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Just the wind in the trees." I busied myself with preparing one of my dehydrated meals, though I had little appetite. Outside, the light continued to fade. I had my headlamp, but the idea of spending the entire night in this cabin, with only that small circle of light against the darkness, filled me with dread. As I forced myself to eat, I made a decision. As soon as there was a break in the storm, I would hike back to the trailhead, even if it meant traveling in the dark. I'd rather face a difficult night hike than stay another hour in this place. But the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, the rain now mixed with hail that clattered against the cabin's roof like thrown pebbles. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the fire, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I checked my watch, 7:45 p.m., hours still until dawn. I decided to try to sleep, to make the time pass more quickly. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and crawled inside, still fully dressed in case I needed to leave quickly. Sleep seemed impossible with the storm raging and my nerves on edge, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under. I dreamt of Eleanor Blackwood. In my dream, she stood beside her own grave, her face as blank and worn as her stone angels. She beckoned to me with one pale hand, her lips moving in that same eerie song. I startled awake to absolute darkness. The fire had died to embers, casting only the faintest red glow. Outside, the storm still raged, but something had changed. There was a scratching at the cabin door, light at first, then more insistent. It could have been a branch blown by the wind, but it sounded deliberate, rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I fumbled for my headlamp with trembling hands, nearly dropping it before managing to switch it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cabin's interior. Nothing had changed, but the scratching continued. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. 3 distinct knocks, deliberate and clear. My throat closed with terror. There shouldn't be anyone else out here, not in this storm, not at this hour. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer, just another 3 knocks, louder this time. I rose from the cot, my headlamp trained on the door. "Hello? Is someone there? Are you hurt?" The reasonable explanation was that another hiker had been caught in the storm and was seeking shelter. But a deeper part of me, a primal instinct I couldn't ignore, screamed that I should not open that door under any circumstances. "I'm sorry," I called, louder now. "The cabin is barely big enough for one. There's an overhang on the east side that might provide some shelter from the rain." Another 3 knocks, so forceful that the door shuddered in its frame. Then a voice, a woman's voice, hollow and distant despite seeming to come from just outside. "Let me in, Emily." My blood turned to ice. I hadn't told anyone my name, hadn't seen another soul since leaving the trailhead that morning. "How do you know my name?" My voice shook uncontrollably. A soft laugh, the same brittle laughter I'd heard in the cemetery. "I know all about you, Emily Hall. I know about the darkness inside you, the thoughts you try to hide. Let me in, and I'll set you free from them." "Go away," I whispered, backing toward the far wall of the cabin. "You're not real." Another laugh. "Not real? Why don't you look out the window and see for yourself?" Against every instinct, I turned my headlamp toward the cabin's single window. For a moment, there was nothing but the reflection of my own terrified face. Then, a pale visage appeared behind my reflection, a woman with long dark hair plastered to her skull by the rain, her eyes black hollows in a face as white as bone. Her lips moved in that now familiar song. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. When I looked again, the face was gone. But the singing continued, now seeming to come from all around the cabin, from the very walls themselves. The temperature plunged further. My breath clouded thickly in front of me, and frost began to form on the inside of the window. The last embers in the wood stove died with a hiss, plunging the cabin into darkness except for my headlamp's beam. Something scratched at the walls, not just the door now, but all around the cabin, as if dozens of hands were clawing to get in. The wooden boards creaked and groaned under the assault. I had to get out. Whatever was outside couldn't be worse than being trapped in this cabin as it seemed to close in around me. I grabbed my backpack, not bothering with my wet jacket still hanging by the door. The scratching intensified as I approached the exit, becoming a frenzied scrabbling that made the walls vibrate. My hand closed around the doorknob, which was ice cold against my palm. I hesitated, remembering the face at the window. The decision was made for me when the window shattered inward, showering the floor with glass. Rain and wind rushed in, along with something else, a suffocating presence that seemed to suck the air from the room. Through the broken window came a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching toward me with impossibly long fingers. I yanked open the door and plunged into the storm. Rain lashed at me instantly, soaking me to the skin within seconds. The wind was a physical force, nearly knocking me off my feet as I stumbled away from the cabin. My headlamp provided only a few feet of visibility in the torrential downpour. I had no clear plan except to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. I splashed through puddles and slipped in mud, fighting my way toward what I hoped was the main trail. The darkness was absolute beyond my small circle of light. The forest transformed into a maze of looming shadows and grasping branches. Behind me, I heard the cabin door slam shut with such force that it seemed to shake the ground. The singing rose again, louder now, pursuing me through the storm. I ran blindly, my lungs burning and my legs leaden with exhaustion and cold. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. I lost my footing on a slick section of trail and went down hard, landing in a puddle so deep it momentarily submerged my face. I came up sputtering, my headlamp miraculously still functioning. As I struggled to my feet, I realized with horror that I had no idea which direction I was heading. In my panic, I'd lost all sense of orientation. The trail, if I'd ever been on it, was no longer visible beneath the flood of rainwater that turned the forest floor into flowing streams. I forced myself to stop and think. My instinct was to keep running, but that would only lead me deeper into the wilderness, perhaps hopelessly lost. I needed to orient myself. I dug my compass out of my pack with shaking hands. The small dial spun wildly, settling briefly in one direction before jumping to another. Useless. I tried my phone next, praying for a GPS signal even without cellular service. The screen remained dark when I pressed the power button. Somehow, the battery had drained completely, though it had been at 62% just hours before. A flash of lightning illuminated the forest, freezing the scene in stark white light for a split second. In that moment, I saw her, Eleanor Blackwood, standing between two trees about 20 yards away. Her dress, sodden and gray, clung to a skeletal frame. Her face was in shadow, but I could feel her eyes on me. The forest plunged back into darkness. When the next lightning flash came, she was closer, halfway to me, one arm outstretched, fingers splayed like claws. I ran again, no longer caring about direction, driven by blind terror. The singing followed, rising to a wailing shriek that pierced through the thunder and rain. I fought my way through underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, my pack catching on trees and nearly pulling me backward several times. Another lightning flash. She was right behind me, her cold breath on my neck. I screamed and lurched forward, breaking free of the underbrush and suddenly finding myself in open space. I had reached the cemetery again. Somehow, in my blind flight, I had circled back to where this nightmare began. The gravestones gleamed dully in my headlamp's beam, rain sluicing off their weathered surfaces. In the center of the graveyard stood Eleanor's angel monument, seeming to watch me with its featureless face. As another lightning bolt split the sky, I could have sworn the statue moved, its blank head turning to follow my desperate progress through the graves. I had to get out of here, had to find the main trail again. I tried to recall the route I'd taken from the trailhead to the cemetery. It had been east of the main trail, so logic dictated I needed to head west. But which way was west in this storm, with my compass malfunctioning and no stars visible through the clouds? I made a desperate decision and ran to the cemetery gate, hoping to pick up the small trail that had led me here initially. As I reached the gate, a bolt of lightning struck a massive ponderosa pine just outside the cemetery fence. With a tremendous crack, the tree toppled, its massive trunk crashing down across the gate and the trail beyond, blocking my exit. Flames briefly licked at the splintered wood despite the rain, casting a hellish glow over the graveyard before sputtering out. I was trapped. I whirled around, searching frantically for another way out. The wrought iron fence surrounding the cemetery was too high to climb easily, especially in my exhausted state. The only other exit appeared to be a small maintenance gate on the far side of the graveyard, barely visible through the curtain of rain. I started toward it, weaving between gravestones, my feet slipping on the muddy ground. The singing had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the rain and my own ragged breathing. I was halfway across the cemetery when my headlamp began to flicker. "No, no, no," I pleaded, shaking it desperately. The light steadied momentarily, then dimmed significantly. Battery failure. The final betrayal of technology. In the fading light, the gravestones around me seemed to shift and move, closing in like a stone forest. My light caught a pale figure darting between them, there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure it was real. I redoubled my pace nearly at the maintenance gate now. My headlamp gave one final valiant effort, brightening briefly before dying completely. I was plunged into absolute darkness, lost in a sea of stone and rain. Lightning flashed again, and I used that momentary illumination to orient myself. The gate was perhaps 15 feet ahead. I stumbled forward blindly, hands outstretched, searching for the metal latch I'd glimpsed. My fingers closed around cold iron. The gate latch. As I fumbled with the rusty mechanism, trying to lift it with numb fingers, I became aware of a presence directly behind me. The air temperature plunged, my exhaled breath clouding thickly before me. "Eleanor," I whispered, not turning around. "Let me go. Please." A whisper in my ear, so close that cold lips brushed my skin. "You came to me, Emily. You sought me out." "I didn't know," I choked out. "I'm sorry." "Everyone is sorry in the end." Her voice was almost gentle. "But sorrow isn't enough. You need to pay the price for disturbing my rest." The latch finally gave way with a grinding shriek of metal. I shoved the gate open and stumbled through, not looking back. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than remaining in that graveyard with her. I found myself on another narrow trail, barely discernible in the darkness between lightning flashes. I followed it blindly, one hand extended before me to ward off branches, the other trailing against tree trunks to maintain some sense of the path. The ground began to slope upward, the trail becoming steeper and rockier. I slipped repeatedly on the slick surface, my hands and knees scraped raw from falls. The rain continued relentlessly, and I was shivering uncontrollably, my wet clothes offering no protection against the unseasonable cold. Behind me, I heard movement in the underbrush, methodical, steady, unhurried. She knew I couldn't escape. She was toying with me. The trail crested a small ridge, then began to descend. In the distance, through a momentary break in the rain, I caught a glimpse of lights. Tiny, distant, but unmistakably human. Civilization. Hope surged within me, lending strength to my leaden limbs. I began to run downhill, heedless of the treacherous footing. If I could just reach those lights, reach other people, surely I would be safe. The rational part of my mind knew I was still miles from any town, that the lights must be some isolated ranch or perhaps even a hallucination born of desperation. But rationality had no place in this night of horrors. The sound behind me ceased. For a moment, I dared to hope that Eleanor was bound to her cemetery, unable to pursue me beyond its borders. Then the singing began again, now seeming to come from ahead of me, from the very direction of the lights I was racing toward. I faltered, my steps slowing. The lights flickered, then organized themselves into a pattern, a ring of small flames floating above the ground. As I watched, transfixed with dread, the circle expanded, revealing dark figures moving around it. The singing emanated from them, many voices now, all performing that same discordant melody. I stumbled backward, away from whatever ritual was unfolding ahead. As I turned to retreat up the trail, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. My head struck something solid, a rock or fallen log, and pain exploded behind my eyes. For an indeterminate time, I floated in a gray haze between consciousness and oblivion. When awareness returned, the first thing I registered was silence. The rain had stopped, and the wind had died. I lay face down in mud, my cheek pressed against cold earth. With tremendous effort, I raised my head. The forest was still dark, but a faint grayness on the eastern horizon suggested dawn wasn't far off. I had survived the night. Every muscle in my body protested as I dragged myself to my feet. My pack was gone, lost somewhere during my wild flight. My clothes were torn and caked with mud, my skin a mapwork of scratches and bruises. The gash on my forehead had stopped bleeding but throbbed with my heartbeat. I took stock of my surroundings. The trail I'd been following was clearly visible now, winding down toward a valley. There was no sign of the ring of lights I'd seen, no evidence of any human presence. Had I hallucinated it all? The storm had been real enough, and my injuries certainly weren't imaginary. But Eleanor Blackwood, the singing, the pursuit through the forest, could those have been delusions brought on by exhaustion, isolation, and fear? I wanted desperately to believe that explanation. I began walking downhill, moving slowly due to my injuries but steadily. As the sky lightened, I could make out more of the landscape. The trail eventually joined a wider dirt road, an old logging route perhaps. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a highway or at least a more traveled area where I might find help. After about an hour of walking, I came around a bend and saw a small cluster of buildings ahead, a gas station, a diner, and a few houses. Relief washed over me. I quickened my pace despite my body's protests, fixated on reaching these outposts of normality. The gas station was just opening as I approached. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with a weathered face, did a double-take when she saw me. "Good Lord, honey. What happened to you?" she exclaimed, ushering me inside the small attached convenience store. I must have been a frightening sight, soaked, muddy, bloodied, and wild-eyed. I tried to formulate a coherent explanation but found I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. Tears welled in my eyes, the emotional aftermath of terror finally catching up with me. The woman, whose name tag read Doris, sat me down on a plastic chair and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. She pressed a bottle of water into my hands and told me to sip slowly while she called for help. "You must be the hiker they've been looking for," she said as she dialed. "There's been search parties out since yesterday evening when that storm hit. Rangers knew anyone caught out in that would be in trouble." I nodded mutely, focusing on the water, the plastic chair, the fluorescent lights overhead, anchoring myself in the mundane reality of the gas station. When I finally found my voice, I told Doris and later the Rangers who arrived to transport me to a hospital in Colorado Springs a sanitized version of events. I'd been caught in the storm, sought shelter in an old cabin, become disoriented, and spent the night lost in the woods. I said nothing about Eleanor Blackwood, the cemetery, or the singing. Those details would only mark me as hysterical or delusional. At the hospital, I was treated for mild hypothermia, dehydration, and my various cuts and bruises. The doctor said I was lucky. Exposure in such conditions could have been fatal. I nodded and thanked him, not trusting myself to say more. I was discharged the following day. A kind ranger drove me back to my car, which was still at the trailhead parking lot. As we approached Black Forest, I felt my chest tighten with renewed fear. "The cemetery, up here," I ventured, trying to sound merely curious. "The old one with the angel statue. Do you know much about it?" The ranger, a young man named Rick, glanced at me. "Black Forest Cemetery? Sure, it's a historic site. The original settlers of this area are buried there. Have you heard any stories about it? Local legends, that sort of thing?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, there's the usual ghost stories. Locals say one of the women buried there was accused of witchcraft, Eleanor Blackwood. Supposedly, she cursed the town before they hanged her." My blood ran cold. "Hanged her? But her grave says that she died naturally? Yeah, the town fathers wouldn't admit to the hanging, called it suicide in the official record, or so the story goes." He glanced at me again. "It's just a campfire tale, though. Nothing to it." I nodded and fell silent for the remainder of the drive. When we reached my car, I thanked Rick for his help. As he turned to leave, he paused. "By the way, your backpack was found this morning, just outside the cemetery. Rangers will drop it off at the address on your ID once they've processed it." He smiled. "Might want to wash everything thoroughly, though. Looks like you dropped it in a mud puddle." I froze. "My backpack? At the cemetery?" "Yeah, right by the gate. Weird, huh? The storm must have really disoriented you." He gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Happens to the best of us. Nature can be unpredictable." I nodded mechanically and thanked him again before getting into my car. As soon as I was alone, I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably with my head pressed against the steering wheel. It hadn't been a hallucination. She was real, and something of mine was still with her. It took me nearly 20 minutes to compose myself enough to drive. I started the engine with shaking hands, desperate to put as much distance between myself and Black Forest as possible. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my gaze was drawn to the tree line. For just a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure standing between two ponderosas, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached Denver, though my body screamed for rest. I checked into the first hotel I found, not caring about the expense. All I wanted was a locked door, hot water, and clean sheets, the trappings of civilization to ward off the memory of what I'd experienced. In the shower, I scrubbed until my skin was raw, as if I could wash away the touch of the supernatural along with the forest mud. I ordered room service but could barely eat, nausea rising every time I closed my eyes and saw Eleanor's face hovering behind my reflection. I slept fitfully, jolting awake at every sound. The ice machine down the hall, other guests returning late, the heating system cycling on and off. Each time I expected to see a skeletal figure standing at the foot of my bed or hear that discordant singing floating through the walls. Morning brought no relief. I checked out early and drove home to my apartment in Boulder, stopping only for gas and coffee that I barely touched. Once home, I double-locked my door, closed all the blinds, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child afraid of the monster in the closet. For 3 days, I barely left my bedroom. I called in sick to work, ignored texts from friends, and subsisted on delivery food that I forced down without tasting. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of Eleanor's presence lingering just beyond my perception. On the 4th day, there was a knock at my door. When I peered through the peephole, I saw a Forest Service uniform. My backpack had been returned as promised. The ranger, a different one than Rick, seemed concerned by my appearance. I hadn't showered since returning home, and dark circles shadowed my eyes from lack of sleep. I thanked him hastily and took the pack, eager to close the door on the outside world again. I set the backpack in my bathtub, not wanting to touch it more than necessary. It looked ordinary enough, muddy and scratched from its ordeal, but otherwise unremarkable. Still, I couldn't bring myself to open it. That night, I dreamt of the cemetery again. In the dream, I stood before Eleanor's angel monument, but now my name was carved beneath hers on the stone. I woke, gasping, sheets twisted around me like grasping hands. A sound drew my attention to the bathroom, a soft scratching coming from inside. My backpack. Something was moving inside my backpack. I lay frozen, unable to summon the courage to investigate, but equally unable to ignore the sound. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the scratching stopped. Silence settled over the apartment once more, somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. When dawn finally arrived, I forced myself out of bed and approached the bathroom on unsteady legs. The backpack sat exactly where I'd left it, seemingly innocent in the morning light. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and unzipped the main compartment. Everything looked normal at first glance: my spare clothes, my toiletry kit, my now ruined map. But as I cautiously removed these items, I found something that didn't belong: a small leather-bound book with age-darkened pages, identical to the journal I'd found in the cabin. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The first half contained the same entries by Ranger Thomas Garrett that I'd read during the storm, but where the journal in the cabin had ended abruptly, this one continued. May 30th, 1923. I tried to leave today, made it as far as Colorado Springs before the singing started again. She's in my head now. I keep seeing her everywhere, in shop windows, in the faces of passers-by. I have to go back. She won't let me leave. June Seung, 1923, back at the cabin. The symbols are carved into every wall now, though I don't remember doing it. I'm so tired but afraid to sleep. When I close my eyes, I see her standing over me. June 5th, 1923. Someone will find this journal. When they do, know that she isn't content to stay with the dead. She collects souls. Jenkins was first, but I won't be the last. She's hungry, so hungry after all these years. June 7th, 1923. She's here now, watching as I write these final words. She says others will come, drawn to her grave as I was. She says I'll help her call to them. God forgive me for what I'm about to do. The entry ended there, the final words trailing off in a shaky scrawl. Tucked into the last page was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated June 15th, 1923. Forest Ranger found dead. Thomas Garrett, 34, a U.S. Forest Service ranger stationed near Black Forest, was discovered hanged in his cabin on June 8th. Authorities ruled the death a suicide, citing Garrett's increasingly erratic behavior in recent weeks. Garrett is the second ranger to die under unusual circumstances in the area this year, following the disappearance of William Jenkins in May. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I read the article. Garrett's suicide mirrored Eleanor's supposed death, both officially ruled as such, but with whispers of something more sinister. As I set the journal aside, something else caught my eye. A small object wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my pack. I hesitated, every instinct warning me not to touch it. But an inexorable curiosity, The same that had drawn me to the cemetery in the first place compelled me to unwrap it. Inside was a carved wooden figure about 4 inches tall, a crude representation of the angel from Eleanor's grave. The wood was dark with age and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Turned over, the base revealed the same strange symbols I'd seen on the monument. I dropped the figure as if it had burned me. It clattered into the bathtub, landing face up, its blank eyes seeming to stare directly at me. That was when the singing started. Faint at first, almost at the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. The same discordant melody that had haunted me in the forest was now in my apartment, seeping through the walls like poison gas. I fled. I didn't bother packing, didn't even change out of my pajamas. I just grabbed my car keys and ran, not stopping until I was behind the wheel and pulling out of the parking lot. I drove aimlessly, the singing following me everywhere. It wasn't coming from outside anymore, it was inside my head. For weeks I drove across the country, staying in cheap motels and never remaining in one place for more than a night. I ditched my phone, paid cash for everything, tried to disappear. But she always found me. Sometimes I would wake to find those symbols scratched into the motel room walls, though I had no memory of putting them there. Other times I would catch glimpses of her in mirrors or windows. Never directly, always in the corner of my eye. The singing grew louder with each passing day. I stopped sleeping, existing in a haze of exhaustion and terror. Twice I checked myself into psychiatric facilities, desperate for medication that might silence the voice in my head. The drugs helped briefly, but she always broke through eventually. 3 months after my encounter in Black Forest, I found myself driving back to Colorado, drawn inexorably toward the place where this nightmare began. I fought the compulsion for days, taking random exits and backtracking hundreds of miles, but my resistance was futile. She was calling me home. I reached the Black Forest trailhead on a clear autumn afternoon. The parking lot was empty. Hiking season was winding down with the approach of winter. The forest looked benign in the golden light, nothing like the nightmare landscape of my memories. As I stepped onto the trail, a strange calm settled over me. The singing, which had tormented me for months, softened to an almost pleasant melody. I knew where I was going, and more disturbingly, I knew what awaited me there. The hike to the cemetery took less time than I remembered. The trail seemed to guide my feet, drawing me unerringly toward Eleanor's domain. When I reached the rusted gates, they swung open at my touch, welcoming me back. The graveyard was peaceful in the afternoon sun, the weathered stones standing in silent rows. Eleanor's angel monument gleamed white against the dark pines surrounding the cemetery. I approached it slowly, no longer afraid but filled with a resigned acceptance. The inscription had changed. Beneath Eleanor's name and dates, new words had been carved into the stone. Emily Hall, 1992-2024. She returned to me as they all do. I should have been terrified seeing my own death carved in stone, my own death dated for this very day. Instead, I felt only a weary recognition. Of course it would end this way. It had always been leading to this moment. I sat on the ground before the grave, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The shadows of the tombstones lengthened across the cemetery floor, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. As darkness fell, I heard footsteps behind me, light and deliberate. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. "You've been waiting for me," I said quietly. Eleanor's voice came from just behind my left shoulder, as cold and hollow as I remembered. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time, Emily. Someone who would hear my song and answer it. Someone who would help me." "Help you do what?" "Break free." Her skeletal hand came to rest on my shoulder, impossibly heavy. "This cemetery has been my prison for over a century, but with each soul I collect, the walls weaken. You will be the last I need." I should have run. I should have fought. But months of torment had worn away my will to resist. And deeper than that, a part of me was curious. What lay on the other side of Eleanor's dark gift? What would it feel like to surrender to the song that had haunted me for so long? "Will it hurt?" I asked, watching as the last light faded from the sky. "Only for a moment," she promised, her voice almost gentle. "And then you'll be part of me, part of us. You'll help me call the others who will come after." Her hands moved to my throat, cold as cemetery earth. As her fingers tightened, cutting off my breath, I saw them emerge from between the graves, translucent figures with hollow eyes and reaching hands. Jenkins, Garrett, others I didn't recognize, all of them singing that terrible, beautiful song. My vision darkened at the edges. My lungs burned for air. As consciousness began to slip away, I felt a strange sense of belonging. I would never be alone again. I would be part of Eleanor's chorus, calling to lost hikers and curious souls, drawing them to us one by one until we were legion and the walls of our prison crumbled at last. With my final breath, I joined the singing. 3 hikers went missing in Black Forest over the next year. The authorities blamed harsh weather conditions, treacherous terrain, simple bad luck. But locals whispered other theories. They spoke of strange singing heard deep in the woods on moonless nights. They mentioned the old cemetery where a new name sometimes appeared on the Blackwood monument, only to vanish days later. And some swore they had seen a woman with long, dark hair wandering the trails at dusk, humming a discordant melody that lingered in the mind long after she had vanished among the trees. A woman who, if you looked closely, wore my face,